Good morning, everyone. Delighted to welcome Tristan Hunt to this Jaipur Literature Festival. Now, many of you are familiar with Tristan for his at least two seminal works on history. One was Building Jerusalem, and now the 10 Cities of the Empire, both in some way connected with urban history, the Victorian project. That's one facet of Tristan. He wears another, maybe more exciting, sometimes more challenging hat, that of, he used to be the shadow education spokesman for the Labour Party till he was very unceremoniously purged by people who thought he was all wrong. So at present, I think he's more history, less Labour, or less politics. Tristan, you're going to give it.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. I can't think of anywhere more splendid to spend my wilderness years than at the Jaipur Literary Festival. I just want to begin the... Ladies and gentlemen, on the 30th of June 1997, the 99-year lease on the new territories came to an end, and Great Britain handed back Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. At the stroke of midnight, the Union Jack was lowered to the strains of God Save the Queen. The Hong Kong police ripped the royal insignia from their uniforms, and Red Army troops poured over the border. Steaming out of Victoria Harbour, as the Royal Marines played Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory on the last symbolic voyage of the Royal Yacht Britannia, Britain's last governor, former Conservative Party chairman Chris Patten, wrote, "That night we were leaving one of the greatest cities in the world, a Chinese city that was now part of China, a colony now returned to its mighty motherland in rather different shape to that in which it had become Britain's responsibility a century and a half before." In his own memoirs, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, recalled of the ceremony a tug, not of regret, but of nostalgia for the old British Empire. He also admitted to a startling failure to appreciate the historic significance of the return of Hong Kong as a rising, newly prosperous China sought to take its place in the world and shed the memory of its century of humiliation at the hands of British, French, and American forces. There is also this rather curious story of Tony Blair as the newly elected Prime Minister flying from Britain to Hong Kong, arriving on a VC-10, incredibly jet-lagged, whereupon the Chinese Premier thought he'd test out Tony Blair's knowledge of William Shakespeare, which was not great. So it wasn't a tremendous start. But there was one member of the British delegation keener to cling on to the past. In a confidential diary entry entitled The Great Chinese Takeaway, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales laid bare his despair at seeing the Crown colony return to the mainland. Watching another piece fall from his family inheritance, the Prince of Wales lamented the ridiculous rigmarole of meeting the old waxwork Yang Zemin and the horror of watching an awful Soviet-style ceremony in which Chinese soldiers goose-step onto the stage and haul down the Union Jack. And it's so heartening the Prince of Wales no longer makes these kind of gaffes. But Charles, Philip, Arthur, George, Mountbatten, Windsor knew all too well that when his time came to assume the throne, the loss of Hong Kong meant that Britain's imperial role would be long past. Such is the end of empire, I sighed to myself. But if the British Empire has indeed come to an end, its legacies remain nonetheless apparent all around the world. And the most compelling of these phenomena still with us is, I think, the chain of former colonial cities from Dublin to Mumbai, from Melbourne to New Delhi. So my book seeks to explore that imperial story through the urban form. 10 cities charting the rise and fall of the British Empire, charting the changing character of British imperialism through the architecture and civic institutions, the street names and fortifications, the material culture and the ritual. Because part of the purpose of the book is also to move the debate about our colonial history from so much of the good and bad cul-de-sac in which we find it. The history of colonialism covered in this study suggests a more diffuse process of exchange, interaction, and adaptation, which also shaped us in Britain as much as it shaped the world. So what does the history of these cities reveal? My story begins on the eastern seaboard of America, where in the mid-17th century a band of Puritan merchants and settlers sought to craft a New England, getting away from the Catholic despotism of Stuart England. And famously, they decided to build a city on a hill, in the words of Governor Winthrop, and they called it Boston, after the town in Lincolnshire where one of them came from. They wrote, "This neck of land is not above 4 miles in compass, in form almost square, having on the south side at one corner a great broad hill whereon is planted a fort." And what you see, if you can see this picture, is how nautical Boston was at the time. It's all been infilled since. It's infilled in the 19th century, but this was a trading seaport. And it was also a place of goods as much as godliness. Because during the 18th century, Boston, Philadelphia, New York were regarded as much part of British culture as Exeter or York or Leamington Spa. And the materials that went into Boston, the pottery, the books, the newspapers, were regarded as part of British culture. And the reason I like this image is you see both the spires of the churches and chapels, and then you also see the spires of the ships coming in to Boston port. So this was a cultural Anglicanism, whereby the culture of the British in Great Britain and America was almost the same. But Boston grew rich on war. It grew rich on the British imperial wars against France and Spain. And after a while, the British Parliament, as we tend to do, asked them to pay for it. We asked the people of Boston to pay for the Navy and the Army, and the people of Boston didn't think that was a good idea. And we began by asking them to pay through a tax on essentially publications. The Stamp Act was an attempt to pay on newspapers and books, even playing cards. And there was resistance in the American colony about paying these kind of funds. And what I love about this image is that then in Britain, pottery workers in Derby thought they could make money by supporting resistance of American colonists to British government policy. So they're exporting teapots to Boston, promoting resistance in the colony. But of course what went in the teapots was tea. And when the British government sought to tax tea leaves, this is when things really kicked off. And here we have a wonderful image of the Boston Tea Party. In America, of course, the Boston Tea Party is the beginning of that great moment of no taxation without representation. There's also a history that was really an attempt to keep the smuggling routes open rather than pay legitimate taxation. Either way, this was the moment of division between America and Great Britain. And Boston goes from being one of the most loyal, royal cities in the British Empire to the heartland of resistance to British colonialism in America. So my first city is Boston, but what often goes with tea is, of course, sugar. And my second city is in the Caribbean, the capital of Barbados, Bridgetown. And the history of the British in the West Indies is a salutary and harsh reminder of the raw brutality, oppression, and racism involved in so much of the colonial project. The British became involved in sugar production from the late 1600s using techniques developed by the Dutch and the Brazilians. And here, if you can see in this image, this is actually a French image. You see the cane being brought in from the fields. You see it being crushed in the top right-hand corner through the crushers, and then the juice is taken to the boiling rooms. But the Amerindians, the native indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean, were always hostile to being involved in this. The British attempted to import Irish workers who weren't so successful. So then the British began the forced importation of millions of slaves into the Caribbean. And it's the slaves who work the field, and they turn the island of Barbados into one of the richest islands in the entirety of the British Empire. And here you have a sense of the wealth coming in to Bridgetown, into Carlisle Bay. I love this picture mainly because of the Caribbean clouds you see skimming across the top. But the importance of Bridgetown was that it was the most easterly of the Caribbean ports. So the slaves would come in from West Africa, land in Barbados, be distributed across the Caribbean islands, and then out from Bridgetown, Barbados, would go the finished sugar products of the Caribbean back towards Europe. And the money from the sugar industry helped to keep funding the growth of the British Empire. So Boston, and then Barbados, and my third city of empire in the beginnings of the Atlantic Empire takes us back across the Atlantic to arguably one of the earliest of the British colonial possessions, which was Ireland. Ireland was England's earliest colony, and from the plantations of the late 16th century, the English and the Scottish had settled its lands, and as such they became a part of the Irish nation. These settlers and their descendants, the so-called Protestant ascendancy, turned the city of Dublin during the 18th century into a showcase of their civilization. We often don't think of Dublin as a colonial city, not least because so much of Georgian Dublin, colonial Dublin, was destroyed in the latter half of the 20th century as a free island sought to shed all the vestiges of a colonial past. And there are these extraordinary accounts of why it was so important to knock down the Georgian terraces and Georgian squares. One correspondent to a 1960s newspaper wrote, "Georgian buildings are an offence to all true blue Irishmen. They are a hangover from a repressive past, and they must go." Thankfully, one that didn't go is this. This is Leinster House, named after the Duke of Leinster, now the seat of the Irish Parliament. But the architecture here was the architecture of the plantations. It was a colonial architecture brought into the heart of Dublin. But what we also see in Dublin is the union of England and Ireland together. This is an image from the Custom House in Dublin. And you see in the middle of it, if you can see, Britannia and Hibernia sitting together. So Britain and Ireland coming together under the colonial project. And at either side of them are the ships that are bringing in the wealth to Dublin. And this gets complicated in British-Irish relations, because on the one hand, Ireland is a colony. On the one hand, Ireland is subject to imperialism. On the other hand, Dublin and Ireland get rich through the British colonial project, and many would go from Ireland to work across the world in the British Empire. So Ireland becomes more and more, Dublin becomes more and more British in its architecture. And here you see, in the heart of Sackville Street, a statue of Lord Nelson. Lord Nelson appeared across the cities of the British Empire. But again, after the independence of Ireland, not everyone was totally delighted to have a huge statue of Nelson in the middle of their capital city. And at a meeting of the Dublin City Council in December 1953, a letter was submitted from the Honourable Secretary of the IRA Dublin Brigade, enclosing a copy of a resolution adopted by the Dublin Brigade Council calling for the removal of Nelson's pillar. And this was basically the IRA saying, Nelson's coming down and we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Dublin City Council didn't react swiftly enough, so in 1966 it was blown up. So Boston, Bridgetown, Dublin, the three cities of the Atlantic, Empire, the beginnings of British colonialism. I now want to move to India, but to get to India, we have to go through my fourth city, which is the master link of connection between the Western and Eastern world, otherwise known as the brothel and tavern of the two oceans, Cape Town. Cape Town, of course, was colonized by the Dutch originally, and it was a provisioning station, it was a watering station for the Dutch on their journey to the Dutch East Indies. And there the great East Indiamen could pick up water, fresh fruit, fresh meat. And here you see a beautiful depiction by Lady Anne Barnard of how Cape Town looked in the early 1800s. But the Dutch were great town planners. And so here you also see the straight streets, the incredibly successful use of water coming down from Table Mountain to provide the water for the fruit trees, to provide for the provisioning station. And there was always the drama of Cape Town as well. Cape Town caught the European imagination, and you have these wonderful accounts of people having travelled months and months across the sea and then seeing the tablecloth, as it was known, above Table Mountain, the white clouds sitting atop Table Mountain, and their heart lifts. The British were perfectly happy with the Dutch as the colonial possessors of Cape Town when it was a free port open to all trading goods. But in the 1790s, revolutionary France invades Holland, and then suddenly there is a fear that the colonies of Holland, the Dutch colonies, will fall under French hands, and that was unacceptable to the British because if Cape Town fell into the hands of the French, that meant that the route to India would be blocked. As one Royal Navy official put it, what was a feather in the hands of Holland will become a sword in the hands of France. And so in the early 1800s you see multiple tussles between the British and the Dutch for the control of Cape Town. And by the 1810s, Cape Town is controlled by the British, and you have this steady process of Anglicisation of Cape Town, which so many of the Dutch begin to resent. So what was the prize which Cape Town was so determined to protect? It was, of course, the riches and prosperity coming out of Bengal. It was all of the wealth which the East India Company was taking from Bengal. And its capital, and the capital of British India, was, of course, Calcutta. Nothing could equal the magnificence of my approach to this town, wrote one visitor in the 1780s. For nearly 3 miles, the river, which is as large as the Thames at London, is bordered by lovely, well-built country houses with porticos and colonnades. The town is a mass of suburb palaces in the same style, with the finest fortress in the world. What Calcutta symbolised in many ways was the beginnings of the British Empire's journey from a naval empire to a landmass empire, a sense that the British Empire had ambitions to be a Roman empire, that it was interested in the conquest of land as much as trade and sea. And one man, Richard Wellesley, Governor General of India, brother of the Duke of Wellington, really begins to drive that in the early 1800s. He wants India, he says, to be ruled from a palace and not from a counting house. And you begin to see in the development of Calcutta all of the arrogance and hubris of a grander imperial project. So just almost at the same moment as Edward Gibbon in Lausanne is writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in Calcutta, Wellesley is trying to suggest the beginnings of a new imperial project. The riches that flowed out of Calcutta found their destination in my next city of empire, which is Hong Kong, because the most successful export was, of course, opium. It crept in a most mysterious and fascinating manner into the homes of the rich and the poor, and with its mystic fingers gripped the hearts of old and young, reported one British missionary. Men became paralyzed before this new force. From the poppy fields of Bengal came a lucrative trade in this addictive drug, and here we see one of the clippers ready to go from Calcutta. But they needed a port, of course, to land the opium. The Chinese, increasingly resistant to the British import of drugs. And so the British alighted upon the fragrant harbour. They alighted upon Hong Kong. And here we see in this image the initial warehouses of Jardine and Matheson, the great drug dealers of the early 19th century, and also their go-down, also their palace. Cape Town was a city of the imagination for the British, but so was Hong Kong. What's so bizarre when you read accounts of the British in Hong Kong is how much they refer to Scotland. That this was like a Scotland of the East, the combination of the sort of lush ferns, the granite, sometimes the harshness, and the British give over themselves to this tight little colony in Hong Kong, which becomes the major trading port. After Liverpool, after London, Hong Kong is fundamental to the prosperity of the British Empire. But if Hong Kong was a fragrant harbour, my next city speaks to the growth of an industrial empire. And the man who takes us there is the Jardine Matheson business partner, Sir Jamset Sijijiboy, who linked up Jardine Matheson with the Bombay opium trade. Bombay, as you know, begins as a trading port, but it's really the American Civil War which takes Bombay into its industrial phase. The American Civil War sees the blockade of the southern ports of America, the cotton exporting ports. So they can't get their cotton into Britain. And so Bombay begins to export cotton to Britain, but then begins to think about producing it itself. And so Bombay begins to become really the first industrial city of the British Empire. And why I always love Bombay is because it speaks to me of Birmingham and Manchester, that this is a city of enormous civic pride, which celebrates that sense of civic pride through a proudly municipal architecture. And here we see in the train station, in the municipal buildings, this gaudy confection of Venetian Gothic, Ruskinian Gothic. It's like Balmoral Castle meets the Natural History Museum, all celebrating the power of an urban civilization, an industrial urban civilization, here also at the university. And I'm also drawn to it because one of the designers of it was, one of the designers of the aesthetic of this sort of industrial Gothic was a man called John Lockwood Kipling. John Lockwood Kipling began his career as the professor of art at the Burslem School of Art in my constituency in Stoke-on-Trent. He then goes to Bombay to teach art, and his son Rudyard is of course born in the grounds of the Bombay School of Art. But Rudyard Kipling is named Rudyard after a lake just north of Stoke-on-Trent, a beauty spot which his mother and father loved. So Bombay owns Rudyard Kipling, but I think Stoke-on-Trent does as well. And here we see a wonderful fountain in the middle of Crawford Market, designed by Lockwood Kipling. My next city is Melbourne, and Melbourne is a suburban city. Melbourne is a celebration of a suburban aesthetic. And just as in the late 19th century the British were discovering suburbia, so it also takes place in the colonies. And here you see this remarkable celebration of the domestic aesthetic. But what Australia is also about is a new idea of imperial federation between the white colonies, that somehow the future of imperialism was to be found not necessarily in Britain, but in Australia, New Zealand, Canada. A consciously racist idea about Anglo-Saxon kith and kin, that somehow the crimson tide of kinship was connecting a new idea of empire. And you have this difficult relationship between those growing up in the white colonies, as they were known, of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the British. And they explored this identity through cricket, through test cricket, where you have this extraordinary, really this sort of very Freudian sort of debate about manhood and identity and the mother country, all played out through sport and sportsmanship. You also have the development of this martial language of empire, this public school language of empire, of character, of playing up and playing the game on the cricket fields. And in the early 1900s, what is in a sense so terrifying is that this begins to segue into the lead up to World War I. And one of the most popular poems in the Australian schools in the early 1900s spoke of a team that is ready to take the field to bowling with balls of lead in a test match grim where if one appealed, the umpire might answer dead. My penultimate city is a city you will all know much better than me, New Delhi. New Delhi, to the British imagination as it was being constructed, was almost too difficult to comprehend. The great travel writer Robert Byron wrote, dome, tower, red, pink, cream and white, washed gold and flashing in the morning sun. The traveller loses a breath, and with it his apprehensions and preconceptions. Here is something not merely worthy, but whose like has never been. Just at the moment of decline, the hubris of imperialism creates a modern Versailles. New Delhi was built to last 1,000 years. The architecture of Lutyens was consciously neither indigenous nor British. It was an imperial architecture which somehow segued the British character into the soil and culture of India. It meant to seem almost natural in its hegemony. And famously, the bells were made of stone because they would only ring when the empire would fall, and the empire, of course, was never going to fall. When it was being constructed, the man who enjoyed visiting it the most was the French Prime Minister, who wandered the building site, and he said, this will be the greatest ruin of them all. But of course, it wasn't a ruin. And what is interesting is the degree to which, in a sense, the Indian governing class take on the architecture and feel and fabric of New Delhi. And here we see, if we began with the Boston Tea Party, we end with a tea party on the steps of Viceroy House with the handover. My final city, where I end, is a city made and unmade by imperialism. Liverpool was a city brought to life by colonialism. It begins in the slave trade. It is the great slave city. The ships leave it, go down to West Africa, across the Caribbean, and come back. The riches of Liverpool are built on slavery, and then in the 19th century, it becomes the city where it imports raw materials from the empire, then exports the finished goods from Manchester. On into the 20th century, Liverpool is the great trading city, growing rich from empire, really right up to the 1950s and 1960s. But no city then is more affected by the end of empire. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Liverpool economy, like the Glasgow economy, like the Hull economy, begins to collapse with deindustrialization and the end of empire. As the British economy turns towards Europe and away from empire, the economic underpinnings of Liverpool begin to fall away. And here we see the nadir, which are the early 1980s riots in Toxteth, where all of the economic misery and decline and political maladministration of Liverpool come to a head. So finally, this book traces how the rise and fall of empire has affected not only the history of former colonial cities, but also the story of our own urban past. Because Liverpool has decided now to take a different route. Liverpool's civic leaders have now concluded that their future lies with a former colony, with a country we had a former imperial relationship with, China. The city has twinned with Shanghai. It's dispatched Everton Football Club on a series of soft power friendly. It's spruced up its own Chinatown. And no group is promoting this more than an organisation called the Peel Group, which is a big private developer in Liverpool. And this image, for those of you who know Liverpool, is not Liverpool, but it's how they want Liverpool to be. And in the middle of it is something called the Shanghai Tower, which is a private sector development funded by Chinese money, meaning to revitalise the Liverpool economy. They're also widening the old Manchester Ship Canal to allow more imports into Liverpool and Manchester. So whereas once this city of empire was exporting out to the world, the terms of trade have defiantly changed, and now it is importing. But not everyone is happy. In 2010, the Wirral Society of Local Conservationists condemned these developments and those, quotes, who are dead set on restructuring the riverside entrance into the port of Liverpool in the style of Sydney, New York, or Shanghai. In the language of a regional conservation group, they suggested, it is very feasible that many Wirralians will not like the idea of being Shanghaied. But new empires are now rising, and their force will be felt in a new generation of imperial cities, most likely British cities, across the globe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tristram, for that wonderful overview of your book and the 10 cities. Now, speaking personally, the linkages which connect the erstwhile British Empire are still very much before us. I recall once walking down something called Victoria Street in Melbourne, seeing a majestic bronze statue of the old Queen, and below it was written that this statue had originally been installed in Dublin and had been transposed there sometime in the 1960s. And I could have sworn I'd seen more or less a carbon copy of that same statue in the front foyer of Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. Yes. Now, what's fascinating about empire, the linkages, the public architecture, which incidentally is probably profoundly Victorian. And I think that's a point which has to be, that really the earlier part of empire, or even the latter part, which is only New Delhi, it's really Victorian sensibilities which shape the urban landscape of the cities. Now, coming back to this entire question of how in the contemporary world we deal with this legacy, with these icons of empire. You've given the example of Dublin, where Nelson's statue was blown up as a gesture of grand anti-imperialism. And I think a lot of the Georgian architecture was also destroyed. And then there is Melbourne, which celebrates it. And there's Calcutta, which has suddenly rediscovered it. And Delhi, which really doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Overall, as a historian, how do you see the post-empire legacy playing out in the contemporary world?
I think you can chart how contemporary municipal leaders deal with the colonial past as a reflection of how they see themselves and how they see their nation. I think you can understand and you can't criticize the anger and fury of colonial legacies. And so when the Irish were bulldozing the Georgian terraces and the buildings, this was a sense that they wanted a new nation to arise, shed from this past. But then almost economic sentiments begin to take over, and they realize actually that there is value based in this. And clearly you can see this today in Kolkata, where the extraordinary heritage that is available in that city is a remarkable draw to the city. I think what's really interesting is how Mumbai deals with this. And looking back at the history of Bombay, there was always such aggressive modernity about Bombay, such a lack of a sort of preservationist ethic, that some of their approach today almost seems within that slipstream. And they have protected some extraordinary, revived some extraordinarily beautiful parts of the colonial past, but also take a very aggressive and modernist approach in terms of a lot of the civic fabric. So I think it goes in cycles. I think the sort of, often the most advanced thinking about it is to regard the moments of British colonialism as often a very small part in a much longer and deeper and richer history of a nation, and to appreciate it as such.
Well, that can be done partially, but certainly it can be done in the case of Delhi, which really had a prehistory. It certainly can't be done with the case of Calcutta or Bombay or even Cape Town or Melbourne, which were essentially creations of empire. And I think half the problem arises when you try and locate a prehistory of certain things and deny its actual history. And it gets into a lot of muddle.
Yeah, I think the Melbourne example is very interesting, and they're in a terrible state about their history and their sense of their history.
Their own national identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like going to visit national museums, and the national narrative in national museums is totally compelling to see, what is forward and what's about. And if you visit the national museums of Australia, if you visit the story of Melbourne at the Melbourne Museum, you don't know where the city came from, how it arose, what it did. No one is left out. Everyone is included. And as a result, you have no narrative sense of development, and it speaks almost to a lack of confidence about the form and function of that city.
That's postmodern history for you. But there is another interesting facet, again tracing back to the Victorian legacy, which is the quest for civic improvement. Now, you find that in Dublin, I think what do you call it, the Broad Street Commissioners or something.
Wide Street.
The Wide Street Commissioners. You find it in Bombay, where really the only city where there is a tremendous amount of engagement between the Indian elite and the colonial administrators in terms of the improvement of the city and in terms of developing a philanthropic culture. Now, was it a part of the empire project, the urban empire project, to actually foster this? And how much do we get in, say, South Africa? Do we get it in New Zealand? Do we get it in Canada?
You see some really quite considered attempts at town planning through, originally in Dublin, the Wide Streets Commissioners. Many of those ideas are followed in Calcutta. But actually, if you compare the British Empire and its urban planning to the French or the Dutch, there's actually a relative lack of a really cohesive sense of what urban planning looks like. There is much more with the British history, a focus on private enterprise, a focus on local innovation. The French are so much more determined to have a symbol of totalizing French civilization within their cities relative to the British. The British are more incremental in how these develop. And also there's just such difference. You begin with Boston, which is essentially a public-private enterprise, a mix of government support and merchants, and then you end up with New Delhi, which is such a totalizing vision of what a British colonial civilizing force is meant to be about. So there's always, I think, that tension, which in other European colonial powers is more aggressively governmental.
Before I throw the questioning to the audience, let me ask a final question, which is, we often focus, perhaps disproportionately, on how empire has been received in the colonies. But I think it's equally fascinating to explore how empire is today the great existential muddle which is there in Britain over how to cope with the legacy of empire. And it's leading to certain very strange and comic consequences. I mean, the roads must fall being one of the examples of that. How do you think overall cool Britannia, to use the words of your former leader, is coping with this legacy?
I think in the academic field, there's quite rightly a much richer appreciation of the impact of empire on British society, and the whole debate about how our own cities were impacted by it, our own culture, our own identity. I think it's partly refracted at the moment through our relationship with Europe. And once again, we're having a sort of another internal debate about whether Britain should be in Europe or out of Europe. If Britain is out of Europe, what is our place on the world? I thought we had got over this debate. I thought Britain was a modern post-imperial country whose role was in Europe, but also retained a heritage and identity which was outside the common market. But I think the debate about Europe has opened this up again. And then, of course, just the transformation of Britain as a multi-ethnic, a multi-religious society, and the debate about that. And so, exactly as you say, we're debating about whether Oriel College, Oxford, at the moment should remove its statue of Cecil Rhodes. My view on this is that you add to history rather than take away from it. And a very good example of this, I think, is the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, where Trafalgar Square, the totemic celebration of colonialism in the heart of the empire. And we have this empty fourth plinth, and we always have a debate about who should be on there. I thought Gandhi should be on there, but it's left empty as a space for art. And most brilliantly, we had a brilliant Nigerian artist who had a statue, an installation up there called Ship in a Bottle, and it was a glass bottle with Nelson's victory in the ship, but covered in African textiles. And it was a very interesting exploration of Britishness, identity, post-colonialism in the heart of the empire. And there you're adding to the history, you're adding to an understanding of the history, rather than taking things away.
Right. Presumably that's for those who could understand what it meant.
I think we appreciate it.
Questions? Gentleman with the white jacket. Mike.
It may be a slightly strange question, but would you consider Buenos Aires an imperial city? Because although, of course, the Argentine was never ruled by a foreign power, it was entirely developed by foreign capital.
I think that's a very good question. I think you could certainly make that case, and I think the informal empire of trade, if you look again at the port cities in China, many not officially part of the empire, but actually their development and culture and civic planning heavily influenced by empire. And I think there's that sort of late 19th century, early 20th century massive export of capital into railways, into construction, right around the world, which shapes almost a second tier of colonial cities. So I think you could certainly make that case.
Jyoti.
Thank you. Good morning. This question is as much to you, Chopin, as it is to Tristram. Now, I'm wondering, if the mercantile spirit is such a fundamental aspect of empire, what happened to Kolkata versus Mumbai, for example? And if you could elaborate a little bit more, perhaps, or talk a little bit more about the Indian diaspora and how Britain sort of receives the peoples of the empire.
I think on the, I'll divert to Swapin in a minute. I think on the Calcutta versus Mumbai question, they're already debating this in the 1820s and 1830s, and a fascinating history of the loss of a enterprising. The debate we had in Britain in the 1980s was how we lost our enterprising spirit in the sort of latter half of the 20th century. This was the debate in Calcutta in the 1820s as to whether the rural land holdings and the nature of what merchants did with their money somehow undermined that enterprising vision. I think certainly during the 20th century and deindustrialization, you begin to have a different argument in terms of the economies. The diaspora in India, the Indian diaspora in Britain, London in the early 1900s, London in the 1890s, 1900s is the heart of the empire, celebration of sort of colonialism, all the rest of it. But it's the heart of anti-imperialism as well. It's the heart of anti-colonialism. And so much of that debate is developed by the Indian diaspora in London. And so right from the beginning, you have those tensions developed and prosecuted within Britain and developed very effectively, I think.
I think as far as Calcutta is concerned, I think the analogy is quite stark, vivid as far as Liverpool is concerned. I think I find much more of a parallel there of a vibrant city which sort of declines because the terms of trade, the entire pattern of trade changes. There's another thing. Calcutta was essentially, the dynamism of Calcutta wasn't bureaucratic. It was commercial, and it was Scottish commercial. Calcutta is more a Scottish city than any other place ever was. And with the departure, I think what you had was a complete mismatch between commercial capital, which passed on to the hands of the Marwaris, essentially, and a hinterland which saw its salvation in a bizarre, some sort of a Maoist revolution. And this mismatch was never actually successfully played out. So Calcutta just became a monument. It became a monument for people to get out of. And that's what the role of Calcutta has been for the past 40 years. Lovely place to get out of.
But there's also, on the Scottish, the Scottish connection is absolutely right. Singapore as well. The role of the Scottish in Singapore was phenomenal in that city's development.
Hi, my name's Trevor Bodie. I'm an architecture critic in Vancouver, another colonial city, or maybe neo-colonial, or maybe postmodern colonial. The reason I say this is I was hosted by the Peel Group in Liverpool, and I can tell you that those new towers in your image are at least as much inspired by Vancouver as they are Shanghai. So the Empire Strikes Back in your in your argument. Here's my question. I want you to extend your argument now up to the present, see if it works. I'll propose to you that Bangalore is a new kind of colonial city, but of a different modality. One of Fortune 500 companies, office parks with software companies and call centers, shopping malls. Does your argument extend to a city like Bangalore?
There's a very brilliant book by the radical Marxist Californian writer Mike Davis, Planet of Slums, which is an account, in a sense, of how some of the traditional colonial divisions were then reinforced by post-colonial governments upon which you layer global capital. And so traditional bifurcations of race are now in terms of social class, but the management of space and the coordination of space is still almost colonial in its form. I think I'd probably take issue with you, because I think that suggests a lack of agency amongst the extraordinary number of entrepreneurs and business people who've created wealth in Bangalore or other cities, and I think much of it's indigenous wealth rather than imported wealth. But I do think you can, and that's why I think Mike Davis is very interesting on this, I do think you can take some of that colonial thinking about space, the management of space, governance structures, power, into modern urban forms.
Hi, this is Nitin. My question is from both of you, if you could answer both. First, what kind of impact this generation in the Brit, they have of the imperial world, like the shame of the atrocity, the pride of winning over the world or nothing? Second, Swapna will answer this better, I guess. The impact of history, you said a beautiful thing, you said we should add to the history, but the burnt of the history, that is so deep into the people that I think those who have ruled, they have to come forward first to, address those abusers, those burnt, and then the people, some sane people from this world may add to the history. They would be able to add to the history. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the question of the legacies of empire is most fraught and most interesting at the moment in terms of the Caribbean and European history in the Caribbean. And there's a brilliant historian, Sir Henry Beckles, who makes a strong case for reparations for European history in the Caribbean. And he's not asking for money for the Caribbean today, but in terms of education, in terms of cultural connections, in terms of connections between doctors. I mean, in terms of a richer and stronger relationship, based, as he suggests, on, as it were, the debts. Now, I think the history of colonialism I put forward today shows how different, in different parts of the world and different forms it was. The Irish regard themselves as having been, subject to an empire, and yet we know they themselves were part of this process. So I think it is a more complicated. What I wouldn't suggest is what the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, did. He goes over to Jamaica, and the one investment he makes in Jamaica is to suggest that the British could help in building a prison. This didn't seem to me the sort of most diplomatic or effective contribution to the development of the Caribbean.
All I want to say is that, this is a question which really, there's an entire session being devoted to the empire, I think on Monday, so you could attend that. It is an unending battlefield, whether all empires, the legacy of all empires, it's a battlefield, and it's a contemporary battlefield. I mean, battles over history are real and quite vibrant and quite interesting sometimes. All I can say is that to view any empire project, whether it's a Mughal project, whether it's a British project or some other, or even an American project at times, as purely an imposition is only partial. There has always been elements of collaboration within the domestic society, which is really what makes the black and white vision of history rather difficult to always uphold, and which is really I think which makes history far more fascinating. That human behavior is not always to be predictable, is always not predictable, or doesn't always run on exactly anticipated lines.
And this is what's so interesting about Hong Kong. You know, in one mindset for the official Chinese view, Hong Kong taken by the British, built by the British. This thing we have a complicated. Actually, the story of Hong Kong is built by the Chinese. You know, it is an extraordinary achievement by them, and yet it makes it a very complicated relationship as to how you deal with that heritage.
The gentleman there with the beret. Yeah.
Not so much a question as just to, the statue of Queen Victoria that you were talking about is in actual fact in Sydney, next door to the Queen Victoria building, which was refurbished by Malaysian Chinese. But when they wanted to look for a statue of Queen Victoria, they asked around ex-colonies. Bombay wanted to sell theirs to them, but the Irish said you can have it as long as you take it away.
Well, thanks for the correction, Harry. There was.
Thank you. Despite my North English accent, I am now a person of Indian origin, and I'm a Bengali Jamai, and my Calcutta wife is a British citizen now. She was singing Beatles songs before she met me, and I was watching Satyajit Ray films before I met her. But my question really is, I wonder how another generation will see it. You know, our kids, well, they're less interested already, maybe because they're kids, but another generation, will this whole question diminish on both sides, both the good and the bad and the heritage side of empire and its consequences?
I think on the British side, I don't know if it will diminish. Actually, I mean one of the merits of recent reforms into the curriculum in British schools was actually moving away from just relentlessly teaching World War II and Stalin and the Nazis, actually, quite rightly, to teach a story of Britain in the world. And I think that as you know, the challenges of globalization intensify for British society and culture and economy, our education system is beginning to reflect about that and think about us in a global context. And so you do have more and more A-level study options on the history of the Mughals. You do have more and more subjects on Chinese history. So I think there's a richer account of it, which might actually sort of provide a deeper understanding of this history into the future.
Well, I hope the interest doesn't diminish. You know, I think in India we're only about beginning to come to terms with history, and we'll go through a lot of agonies before we actually successfully manage. And the history of empire is just about beginning to be researched, separated from those who were active participants in the whole thing. So scholarly studies, actually burrowing into the archives, oral traditions, etc., the sheer richness of that experience has just about begun to be tapped. And I think it will take a long time before it sort of seeps into the larger consciousness. So I hope there is interest in the subject which persists.
The last question?
The lady in front.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, why, whenever I visit India, and I've been visiting for 20 years, I'm also a person of Indian origin from Britain, I feel there's a very strong feeling against the British Empire in India, but I don't see the same feeling against the Mughal Empire in India, and I just don't understand that.
Oh, you'll be surprised.
So perhaps you can answer that?
I can't answer that. Sophia will answer that. But I think it goes to the point about India has such a profound and long history, and we in Britain obsess about the period of the British in India, when actually there's much richer, longer account. But I can't account for the British Mughals.
In India we have something called the ISI certification, which is a sort of a stamp of approval. Now, the Mughal Empire has been given the ISI certificate, which means it's good. The British Empire still awaits its certification. So, in the official histories of the time, the Mughal Empire is something which is to be identified, worshipped. Oh no, Aurangzeb didn't demolish temples, he chased a rapist down the street, things like that. And even Amartya Sen spoke about how Akbar protected minorities. Excuse me, Hindus were 80% of the population. But yes, it is bound up in a lot of political grandstanding. The whole history of the Mughal Empire as well as the British Empire. You know, one of the worst, I mean, I'm often abused for being an apologist for empire. The reason being, because I say it was not all bad. And now that's not a popular thing to say. Now, if I was to say that there were facets of the Mughal Empire which were not very wholesome, I'm likely to be branded communal. And it happens. So, it's an occupational hazard of how the minefields of history, how you negotiate it. But it's certainly not true that there is a uniformly positive view of the Mughal Empire. I think there are very nuanced views of the Mughal Empire. There's the good and the bad. There's some which we like to remember. The Taj Mahal we like to remember. And Aurangzeb Road, whose name we change. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tristram.
A big round of applause for Tristram Hunt and Swapan Das Gupta for this wonderful session. Thank you so very much for being here. Area. So I would request all of you who have the books to go at the back of the tent to get your books signed. Thank you. Before we begin our next session here, I want to request all of you that please take one seat for yourself. The seats are only for you. These are not for your bags or for your jackets. So if you're sitting on the chair, your bags and your jackets should be either in your lap or on the ground. We don't allow in this festival to reserve seats for the people who are not here yet, and there are people standing on the side waiting to be seated. So seat only for you and not for your bag. I will actually come around and see that your bags are not on the chairs. Anyway, just no reservations of seats for anybody, no exceptions. Here in this festivals, there are no exceptions. We don't reserve seats. That's the rule here. Sorry for being a little strict, but I don't like people just standing on the sides or in the aisles while their chairs just reserved for no reason at all. Thank you. I just want to announce that the session Negroland, that has been cancelled, and instead of that we will have the session Literature versus Cinema, which was supposed to happen in Batak. So that session from Batak, it's moving to Google Mughal tent at 2:30, and session Negroland has been cancelled.
The all-new Ford Endeavour, designed for any terrain, engineered for the extraordinary.
So we have our next session here, Ramcharitmanas, the life of a text. We have Philip A. Latgendorf, Harish Trivedi, and Ashok Vajpayee in conversation here on the stage. And this session is a Dainik Bhaskar Bhasha series. Please welcome the authors on stage. I think Philip is sitting here. Philip, you want to sit here?
I was told by him that I should sit.
No, it's okay.
Can I sit in the middle?
Do you have to go on the stage?
I think not if we have enough.
You want to sit here?
Yeah, it's up to you. Up to you. Yeah, because
अभी
maybe
यंग
in the middle is good.
हाँ तो आप बैठिए मेरे साथ बैठ
दोनों साइड पे जैसे गंगा यमुना.
He doesn't want to move. So why are you saying that he has to move? He is the main person who creates confusion.
लेकिन अगर मैं तैयार हो
We are live now.
Guys, okay. So no joking. Be serious.
No joking. Serious stuff.
इसको निकाल ही देना सुनिए इसको निकाल दे हाँ? So how do we start? ये मान गए ये बहुत ही अच्छा
इसलिए थोड़ा यहाँ.
Shall we start? Well, friends, we are here to discuss the life of a text, Ramcharitmanas. Actually, there are two texts in India, both epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, who have a life which is rarely available to any other epics in the West. Today, as we sit here, maybe in the evening, there will be at least 5,000 performances taking place all over the country, which either relate to Ramayana or to Mahabharata. So these are not texts, scholarly texts, confined to libraries and annotations and such like. They are living texts. And they undergo many, many changes while in this process of performance, singing, what you have. But we have a very unusual thing happening, as my friend Philip has translated. I started translating Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas. This is the 10th translation. 9 translations already exist in English. This is the 10th one. And as you can see, it's very beautifully printed in the Murthy Classical Library of the Harvard University. It is Narayan Murthy's son, Rohin Murthy, who has given endowment to the university, and under which many classics are being translated. What is important, that many of these classics belong to non-Sanskrit Indian languages, which is happening for the first time. Otherwise, it was thought that in the Indological paradigm, most of the times, everything was being translated from Sanskrit. So this is an unusual series, and our friend has done 2 volumes. It's going to be 12, did you say? 7 volumes, so 5 more to come. It's available here in the... Now, to start with, the obvious question, why did you decide to translate that too in English, and for whom?
Thank you. सुनाई दे रहा हूँ सबको? अच्छा. श्री गुरु चरण सरोज रज निज मन मुकुर सुधारी वरण और रघुबर विमल जसु जो दायक फलु चारी. पहले तो गुरु वंदना करना चाहिए ना. But I will speak mainly in English for the international audience and also my mother tongue, of course. Thank you for that question. I never thought of myself as a literary translator, and some people here may know that I wrote a book called The Life of a Text, which is about the subject of Tulsi Ramayan, cultural history. I call it, in Hindi, I would call it a Granth Ka Jeevan Charitra. It's a study of the life of the Ramcharitmanas over 400 years. And I did the research for that mainly in the early 1980s, mainly in UP, in Banaras, Ayodhya, Chitrakoot area. And at that time, I translated a few Panchasatta Chopai Manohar, a few verses here and there for the purpose of illustrating various things, but I certainly never thought of myself as undertaking a literary translation. And two things prompted me, well, let's say three things, okay. Three things prompted me to want to do this. First, the fact that I don't care for most of the existing translations. Always one hopes that one can do a little better. Bhagavad Gita has more than 300 English translations, and people are still trying to get it right. And for such a great work as Ramcharitmanas, I think to have 10 translations is not too many. Second reason was the death of one of my teachers, A.K. Ramanujan, who was a wonderful mentor and guru to me and great inspiration and a great translator. Not from Hindi, but he was a great translator. And that inspired me to want to try my hand at translation. Mane, ab to Raman chale gaye hain, unke baad kya, kaun aayega. So it's like that. And the third thing was the opportunity to work with this particular series, the Murti Classical Library, because of Rohan Murthy's generosity, this series has fantastic resources to work with. And they have put together a wonderful editorial team. And those of you who do publishing, whether academic or literary, you know that nowadays presses, they don't engage copy editors very much. The author has to really do it herself or himself. It's very difficult to get good editorial support, which we all need, all writers need. No matter how good a writer you are, you need a good editor and a good copy editor. I had 2 editors for the English text. I had 2 copy editors for the Devanagari text. And they were wonderful and careful. So these books are brought out with a great deal of love and care. And the other thing that appealed to me was the fact that it's a dual language translation. So you have the Hindi, the Devanagari text on the left, and my free verse English translation on the right. And I was both attracted and frightened by that prospect. Frightened because as a translator I'm very exposed this way, but what to do? Yeah, thank you.
पर आपने अनुवाद ये किया किसके लिए?
किसके लिए? Okay, once more, if you don't mind, I think there are 3 answers to that question. 3 पाठक हैं.
तो सारी सुबह आप तिहाई में गुजारेंगे?
ऐसे रामायणी लोग बहुत बोलते हैं जब पॉइंट्स करते हैं कथा में और याद के लिए. So 3 kinds of readers I think this is for. First of all, if you are a Hindi speaking person जिनकी मातृभाषा हिंदी है, and if you can read the Manas easily and enjoy the Manas in its Awadhi Boli, then of course this is not for you. I mean, you don't need this. Kya zarurat hai? It's not important. But I think I intended this for people whose primary language is English and they would like to read one of the great masterpieces of pre-modern Indian literature in English, and to do a kind of a clear and simple modern English translation. That was my charge. That's what the Murti series asks for, and so I tried to do that. Second kind of reader is perhaps those who are being raised in English medium education in India. They know Hindi, but they don't necessarily know how to read the pre-modern literary languages, Awadhi, Braj Bhasha, etc. And so they can, of course, enjoy, to some extent, the original text, but they can also benefit from, you know, basically my tika, as it were, in English. And I guess the third kind of reader is myself. I did it for myself, as I think any writer or translator would do. And Tulsidas also has said, as you know, Swanta Sukhaya,
Raghunath
Tulsi Raghunath Gatha, Bhasha Nibandhamat Ati Manjulamat Anoti. And in his you know, his Mangalacharan.
Yes.
And my friend, my very dear friend and teacher in Banaras, Bhanuji, C.P.N. Singh used to say that he would, whenever people would say, oh, you know, he wrote the Manas for this reason, and he wrote the Manas for that reason, and he was advocating for this Siddhant, or he was advocating, he would say, no, he has said, I did it to please myself. So, for my own inner satisfaction.
All right for a pre-modern writer to claim from the housetop that I am writing entirely for myself. Now today, if you say that, you will get any number of brickbats. How can you be writing for yourself? You have to write for this huge mass which is listening to you. You can't avoid them. But for Tulsidas it was possible to say. But perhaps for great people it's always possible to say.
No, but I said it last. That was Tisra part.
Yes, go ahead. Let me say a word in praise of the organizers and then 2 words in praise of my old friend Philip Ludgendorff. The organizers, because they could have scheduled this session in the Bathag or in Charbagh or the front lawns or wherever, but very aptly they have chosen to schedule this under the Mughal tent. How secular can we get?
And Tulsidas also wrote under the Mughal tent.
The other thing, as Philip has just said, Tulsidas wrote Ramcharitmanas metaphorically under the Mughal tent. When he completed it in 1574, Emperor Akbar had been on the throne for about 20 years. He was to rule for another 30 years. So very solidly in the heyday of the Mughal Empire, Tulsidas wrote it. One question to ask for many readers would be, does it reflect the fact? Does this high Hindu scriptural text in any way reflect the fact that it is written under Mughal rule? My own perception is that it does not directly. You will have to try very hard to see any shadow of what some people have called a Mlecha-Krant Bharat. That there was foreign rule, rulers from another religion were ruling over it. No. Tulsi, he does not ignore it. He is operating at another level. And yet, in his life, this text was written mainly in Ayodhya and in Kashi, in Banaras. Ayodhya perhaps more. And about his life in Ayodhya, Tulsidas, a sadhu, has written, not in the Ramcharitmanas, but in another work of his, he described the kind of life he was leading when he was writing this. He was begging alms for food. Like a good sadhu, he had no possessions, he had no home. So every day he begged for food and he ate it in the day, and at night he went and slept in a masjid. Mang ke khaibo, masjid ko soibo. Masjid mane masjid. Now, if it is in Ayodhya, it must be the Baburi Masjid. The Baburi Masjid had come up 50 years before.
1574, in 1528. Wow. Now, for Tulsi, just as the Mughal Empire exists at some level remote from him, similarly the Babri Masjid does not impede his Ram Bhakti in any way, because for him it's still the Ram Janmasthal. It may have been demolished if it was there. There is a masjid there, but happily, merrily, without any qualms, he goes and sleeps at night in the Babri Masjid. The complexity, the historical complexity of a text like Ramcharitmanas is evident from the very circumstances of its composition. It's not the Mughal rule, it's not the Mughal tent only, it is Valmiki and the tradition that follows from Valmiki of so many Ramayanas, Adhyatma Ramayana for example, which is as much a source for this as the Valmiki Ramayana. More. As Philip was saying, Swantah Sukhaya, that shlok that he recited, it begins Nana Purana Nigamagam Sammatam Yad Ramayane Nigaditam Kvachidanyatopi. After that it comes to Swantah Sukhaya. पुराणों में, आगम में, निगम में, कई रामायणों में जो भी लिखा गया है वो सब लेते हुए और कुछ थोड़ा सा कहीं और से भी क्वचित अन्यतोपि. दिस इज द हाइट ऑफ मॉडेस्टी. कहां से? यहां से, तुलसीदास के हृदय से, तुलसीदास के मस्तिष्क से. ये सब लेने के बाद कुछ अपना भी है उसमें और वही इसको तुलसीदास का ग्रंथ बनाता है. तो एक तो ये, अब फिलिप हमारे दोस्त हैं 20 साल से, इन्होंने जो किताब लिखी लाइफ ऑफ ए टेक्स्ट, उसमें रामायण की कितनी महिमा है, खासकर परफॉर्मेंस में जो लीला होती है रामलीला, उसके बारे में है अधिकतर. रामनगर में, बनारस में गंगा के पार उधर रामनगर है जहाँ राजा रहते हैं, महाराजा रहते हैं, जहाँ किला है, और इधर तो रामनगर में महीने भर की रामलीला होती है. ये महीने भर सुबह नहा धो के स्वच्छ कपड़े पहनकर पूरे दिन देखते रहे, महीने भर. और उसका इन्होंने वर्णन किया है लाइफ ऑफ ए टेक्स्ट में. अद्भुत पुस्तक है वो मेरे पास आई रिव्यू करने को. वो मैंने, जैसा स्वाभाविक था, जैसा उचित था, मैंने बहुत तारीफ की उसकी. बाद में मैंने एक बात कही, मैंने कहा अब तक इनको भी याद है, मुझे भी याद है. बाद में मैंने कहा कि ठीक है, लीला तो बहुत हो गई, टेक्स्ट कहाँ है? लाइफ ऑफ ए टेक्स्ट, परफॉर्मेंस तो बहुत है. कोई पढ़ते हुए तो नहीं दिखा इसमें, और पढ़ने की क्या महिमा है, पढ़ने से क्या समझ में आता है. तो अब 20 साल बाद रामचरितमानस का टेक्स्ट ये कर रहे हैं, परफॉर्मेंस तो हो गई, अब ये टेक्स्ट कर रहे हैं, उसका अनुवाद कर रहे हैं. और एक बात मैं और कहूँगा, ये शिकागो के पढ़े हुए हैं. मैं 2-3 बार गया हूँ शिकागो में, पढ़ाया है मैंने. एक बार मैं गया तो ये आयोवा से आए थे शिकागो, मैं शिकागो में ही रह रहा था. तो सुबह सुबह हम लोग मिले, एक नाश्ता किया साथ साथ एक वहाँ के रेस्टोरेंट में. फिर इनको आयोवा जाना था, मुझे पढ़ाने जाना था, तो हम लोग कार पार्क तक साथ साथ गए. कार पार्क में खड़े हैं, बात होती जा रही है, दोनों लोगों को देर हो रही है, साथ नहीं छूट रहा है, तरह तरह की बातें हो रही हैं. तो इनसे मैंने बाद में कहा उसको, मतलब कि अब खत्म किया जाए. रामायण की चौपाई गांव में निरक्षर लोग भी हर एक मौके पर एक सही चौपाई हरदम बोल सकते थे. तो उस प्रकार सभा समाप्त करते हुए कार पार्क वाली हमने इनसे कहा, हरि अनंत हरि कथा अनंत कि हरि अनंत है, हरि कथा अनंत है, हम लोगों की बातचीत अनंत है. और आप अपने दिल में टटोल के, इस मस्तिष्क में टटोल के देखिए कितने लोग ये अर्धाली पूरी कर सकते हैं यहाँ. फिलिप ने छूटते ही कहा, कह ही सुने ही बहुविधि शब्द संता. तो ये संत पुरुष हैं और बहुत अच्छा है कि ये कर रहे हैं.
तो मुझे अनुवाद के, आपने अपनी भूमिका में ये लिखा है कि देखने के तुलसीदास ने 14 शब्द इस्तेमाल किए और सुंदर के लिए 22 शब्द इस्तेमाल किए और कमल के लिए 29 शब्द इस्तेमाल किए. तो ये जो इतने शब्द एक ही क्रिया या एक ही गुण के लिए, इसको आपने अनुवाद में कैसे निपटाया है?
हाँ, तो let me rephrase that in English, or you could also.
Oh no, please go ahead.
In the introduction, which is brief because it's part of the Murti program that the introductions not be voluminous and definitive and scholarly. It's intended for a broad audience. But I did write about a number of things, and if I could just follow up on something that Harishji said, one of the things I wrote about is I think there is influence of the Sufi Premakyans, the Avadi Sufi Premakyans, such as the Padmavat of Malik Muhammad Jayasi on Tulsidas in various ways. But I just touch on that in the intro. In answering Ashokji's question, as he pointed out, I mentioned what I call the asymmetry, the asamata? Vishamata. Between the vocabularies of English and Hindi. Both English and Hindi have vast vocabularies, but they're very asymmetrical. And they say that the Arabs have, 50 words for camel, well, the Indians have at least 29 or 30 words for kamal, lotus. Saroj, Pankaj, Jalaj, Rajiv, Neeraj, bahut sare hain. I've made a list from the Manas, and when you read most English translations, what you find is Ram looked through his lotus eyes, and then with his lotus lips, and raising his lotus hand, and falling at his lotus feet. And I don't think that sounds good in English. We don't talk about feet as lotuses, and you could argue that I should keep it very foreign, but in many cases I just said lovely feet, or something like that. And I use lotus now and then when I think it's appropriate, but we only have one word in English, one word, because a water lily is a different plant. It's a different family. So rather than just have the text be lotus, 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 it makes it, to the English ear, it sounds very saccharine, very syrupy and sugary, and it doesn't sound good. And that's not the way the Manas sounds when in Hindi. The Manas has this wonderful musical momentum, and that is the one thing that I've tried to preserve, is what I call gati, some kind of a sense of the gati, the momentum of the text. I can't do rhyme, I can't do a precise meter, but I've tried to keep some gati. And same thing with words for lovely and beautiful. We have a few, and I've used them.
Yes.
And for to see, to gaze at, to look at, to observe. We have some choices, but we don't have as many. And of course, the Manas is all about darshan. It's all about having darshan of Ram and Sita and how beautiful they are. There are six Nakashika passages in Balkand alone of Ram. So, yeah.
The other thing that combines with the Mughal tent is the fact that Ramcharitmanas uses nearly 1,000 words of Arabic and Persian origin. So the language is already in that tent, in a manner of speaking. Awadhi is freely...
He uses more Perso-Arabic words than Jayasi.
Yes, that's
because Jayasi deliberately avoids them as part of his kind of Sanskritic performance. And Tulsidas has no hesitation in saying Gai bahor garib nevaju, saral garib nevaju, Ram ko kehte hain. Gai bahor garib nevaju, saral sabal sahib raghu raju.
Yes.
Raghu ko sahib kehte hain.
ये राजस्थान में लोग सोचते होंगे कि अजमेर शरीफ में ही गरीब निवास हैं। रामायण में भी उन्हीं के नाम से ट्रेन चल रही है।
Another point that you have made in your introduction is about how Tulsidas brought together the Sagun Nirgun concepts of bhakti together in the character of Ram. Now, would you like to elaborate that? Because you said that Murti introductions are not very elaborate, so you have just stated it, but how? because normally, conventionally, तुलसीदास को तो सगुण भक्त मानते हैं और कबीर और दूसरों को निर्गुण, तो ये कैसे?
Well, that's of course where Balkand is so important, because Tulsidas's Balkand is the biggest book. सबसे बड़ा कांड है रामचरितमानस में, लगभग 1/3 है, 1/3, almost 1/3 of the entire epic. And that's why it's had to come out in two books in the Murti format. But the first half of Balkand is what I am calling the prologue. You know, it's a prastavana, do shabd, except it goes on for 190 stanzas, you know. And within that, he puts forward his view on Nirgun Sagun and being the same, and he's very clear about it. I'll just a few lines I will read. I was only this morning reading this. This is the Nam Vandana, very early in 19th stanza of Balkand. Vando Nam Ram Raghubar ko hetu krisanu bhanu himakar ko Bidhi Hari Haramaya Veda Prana so Aguna Anupama Guna Nidhana so Aguna Anupama Guna Nidhana so. It's the incomparable, formless, but it's also the treasury of qualities and forms. In the name, all in the name. Maha Mantra Joi Japata Mahesu Kasi Mukti Hetu Upadesu. And so on. It continues like that. So that's my response on that.
You know, the way you read it, I am reminded of an incident many years ago when we were celebrating 400 years of Ramcharitmanas. You know, there was a huge celebration in the whole of North India, and many classical dancers had composed choreographed new pieces based on the verses from Ramcharitmanas. One of them was Sonal Mansingh. And what she did was, she was choosing the same
passage.
The same way of reciting. So when she performed her Odissi or Bharatanatyam, the verses were read in the conventional way in which they are read in North India, just now as you did it. I sent her to Tikamgarh, and Tikamgarh doesn't even have a real head even now. So in Tikamgarh she went, and 2 days later I got a phone call, and I was getting worried, because you know what used to happen, that these places which didn't have facilities, so they might have taken her in an open jeep from Satna and things of that kind, you know, complained that the mic did not work, or she was not lodged in a proper room and things of that.
And of course, making a phone call in 1974 was also no joke.
So she rang up and she said, I had the most exhilarating experience of my life in Tikamgarh. So I said, how? She said, when my musicians started singing the verses in the conventional way, the 5,000 strong audience started singing with them. So I was dancing to more than 5,000 persons singing for me. Now this is again an evidence of the life of a text, that how it exists in popular imagination, not merely quoting and all, but also remembering. You know, as a young child, I became much worse, of course, like most of us, but quite innocent. And I had, my grandfather, my Nana, was a great devotee of Ramcharitmanas, and he used to do Akhand Path, which means 9 hours of reading Ramcharitmanas without a break. So I dared to accompany him once, and I didn't understand, of course, a word, but he kept on doing like that for 9 hours. That was one. My mother was a very religious person, but she had no god or a statue to worship. She had a copy of the Ramcharitmanas, And every day, by way of puja, she would recite 1 or 2 pages. So her Ramcharitmanas was this thick, not because the paper was thick, because every page had akshat and chandan on it. So here is an epic. I don't think Valmiki's Ramayana ever got that kind of a popularity. Although it's a great work and it is the original work in a sense, but it never got the kind of popularity and the kind of esteem in which the popular, imagination held it in practice also.
And therefore, a question arises from that. What worries me? One of my main worries about the cultural change that we are witnessing. In Tikamgarh, you may still find 5,000 people. In Jaipur and in Delhi,
you will know.
How many people will you find? The audience that we are addressing here is not untypical. These are the 300 million members of our rising middle class. For them, it seems to me that a recovery of the central place that the Ramcharitmanas occupied in our life, not only religious life, but cultural life, literary life, this recovery has now to be attempted. The Ramakatha and the figure of Ram has gone through many vicissitudes. Some of them political and some of them to do with the spread of Western culture and a Western language. There was a time, as you say, when even illiterates in the villages could quote endless chaupais from Ramcharitmanas, each suitable for that occasion. But I'm afraid that ground has now been eroded substantially. And it seems to me there are 2 or 3 factors here to take into account. There has also been an erosion of religion, both in the West and here. More in the West than here. Maybe we'll catch up someday. One great comparison by George Grierson of the Ramcharitmanas is that it is, when he wrote in the 19th century, it was the Bible of North India. That's what he said. The Bible is not very often read these days by many people in the West, and the similar fate is beginning to overtake the Ramcharitmanas. Let us acknowledge this. And let us also clarify, we'll come to Philip who can say it better. I'm trying to formulate an issue for him to address. There are 2 things, 2 aspects of the recovery of Ramcharitmanas that I wish to underline for him to comment on. One is, it's not only about Rama. It's not only an epic. Hindi has 5 epics in the very early centuries of its development. One by Jayasi, 3 other Premakhyan. The 5th one is Ramcharitmanas. It's not the earliest. So all of them are high poetic compositions. But in common consensus, in everybody's opinion who knows Hindi literature, this is the greatest poem ever written in Hindi, from the beginning up to now. Will we let this poetry go? Will we not read it? Will we not continue to read it? Will we not read it, if not for religion, at least for the poetry, at least for the literary content and value? That's one thing. And the other issue that also, after that I'll fall silent and you can address it at length. The other issue that worries me is what has happened to the hero of this epic. And this is a semi-religious issue. It's not a poetic issue, it's a cultural issue, it's not even religious. In 1992, after the Babri Masjid episode, Kafi Azmi wrote a wonderful verse. Rajdhani ki fiza aayi nahi raz tumhe. He's addressing Ram. Rajdhani ki fiza, the atmosphere of the capital, when or the state, the affairs of the political state. That's what he means. राजधानी की फिजा आई नहीं राज तुम्हें, 6 दिसंबर को मिला दूसरा वनवास तुम्हें. That's what Kafi Azmi wrote. On the 6th of December, with the fall of the Babri Masjid, Ram was banished all over again into the forest. This is what has happened. Ram has been abducted from our life. When Sita was abducted, रामचंद्र जी ने जमीन आसमान एक कर दिया, भालू बंदर गिलहरी सब शामिल हुए और लड़ के सीता जी को वापस लाए. आप हमारी दशा देखिए, राम को लोग ले गए उठा के, राम का एबडक्शन हो गया, अपहरण हो गया, सब लोग देखते रहे, जिनको बुरा लगा, जिनको नहीं बुरा लगा, सब लोग देखते रहे। और हम लोगों ने 1992 से अब तक कुछ नहीं किया कि हम राम को वापस लाएं। हमारे जीवन में राम का भी उतना बड़ा स्थान है, हम उनको किस तरह वापस लाएंगे? राम को हम जाने नहीं दे सकते कि एक विचारधारा है, एक प्रकार के लोग हैं, वो राम को ले जाए। और राम के इसमें क्या दोष है? 1952 में जो हुआ वो राम का दोष है ना, किसी और का दोष है। और हम लोग जो उनकी तरह नहीं है, जो उनकी तरह नहीं सोचते, हम लोग जो अलग तरह से सोचते हैं, ये हमारा कर्तव्य है कि उनको हम न ले जाने दें राम को, हम न कहने दें उनको कि राम सिर्फ हमारे हैं, हम सबके हैं, ये हम बार बार कहें। तो राम के अपहरण से जो ले गए हैं कुछ लोग, उनसे हम राम को वापस लाएं। राम सिर्फ धार्मिक नहीं है, राम महापुरुष हैं, तरह तरह के मर्यादा पुरुष हैं, वो मर्यादा अब भी कायम है। और राम का जो यहाँ पर काव्यात्मक वर्णन है वो तो अलग ही बात है, राम का, सीता का। तो हम सबके राम दोबारा हों, अपने अपने राम हमारे पास वापस आए, ये कैसे होगा? ये अंग्रेजी अनुवाद से होगा। आप लोग अंग्रेजी अनुवाद पढ़ें, वही ज्यादा अच्छा है। अवधि तो थोड़ी पुरानी भाषा हो गई है। तो ये फिलिप ने, ए.के. रामानुजन का इन्होंने नाम लिया, इनके गुरुवत थे, गुरु तो शायद नहीं थे, गुरुवत थे इनके। ए.के. रामानुजन ने कहा कि इन इंडिया नोबडी रीड्स द रामायण एंड द महाभारत फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम। बिना पढ़े घुट्टी में अशोक जी को मिली है, हमको मिली है। माँ पढ़ती थी तो हम लोग भी सब सोचते हैं कि हमको भी आती है। आप लोगों में से कई यही हाल होगा, माँ पढ़ती थी, दादी पढ़ती थी, आप हम नहीं पढ़ते हैं, हम नहीं पढ़ते हैं। तो मैंने रामानुजन से एक बार पूछा, वो आए थे दिल्ली हमारे विभाग में, अंग्रेजी विभाग में। हमने उनसे कहा, हाउ मेनी पीपल डू यू नो इन इंडिया हु रीड द रामायण एंड द महाभारत इवन फॉर द सेकेंड टाइम? मान लेते हैं कि हमको आता है। तो ये जो है, इसको हम जाने न दें, इसको हम सब लोग अपना बनाएं। और ये जो है, ये जो संस्करण है, एक बहुत सुंदर है। दिस एडिशन, एज फिलिप showed you physically, has Awadhi on the left hand and English on the right hand, and very elegant, non-archaic, contemporary English. Read the English, and if you like, look on the left-hand page, and your Hindi and your Awadhi will be enhanced. Din Duni, Raj Choguni. So it's a wonderful text for you to pick up.
Thank you so much.
Can you also add to it?
Yeah, I would like to respond to especially the first part of your remarks. The second part, I'm completely sahmat with you on that, and I don't think I can add much. But regarding the first part, if we look at this Murti library as a project more broadly, not just Tulsidas, you know, thanks to the generosity of Rohan Murthy, this series theoretically is supposed to go on forever.
500 volumes.
Well, the model for it is the Loeb Classical Library of Latin and Greek, which now has more than 500 volumes in print. And they stay in print. And they're inexpensive, and they're, you know, a uniform format and affordable and very nice. So that's the model for this, and that was his intention. And, you know, some of you may have seen the interviews that Rohanji gave last year, including here, and I was very touched by them. He was doing a PhD in computer science at Harvard, but he's a very intelligent young man. And he had a free period every semester. And so he took classes with some of the great scholars at Harvard who teach about India. And he took classes on Indian literature, he took classes on Indian philosophy, he took classes on the history of Indian religion. And he read for the first time in his life, you know, Vedanta and Darshana and Alankara Shastras and even, you know, political treatises from ancient India. And he said, my God, there was all this brilliant intellectual culture, and I never learned about it growing up. Why did I never learn about any of this? Why did I have to come to USA, Cambridge, Massachusetts, to learn about these wonderful traditions in my own culture? That was what gave him the prerna, the inspiration for this series. Was to make these texts available cheaply, and they're subsidized, you know, You'll see how inexpensive, especially the paperback is. It's very inexpensive. And to make them available so that people can discover the texts again. I'm not trying to, as far as, what you said about people can't read or understand Tulsidas, it's true. But then again, there are many Jaipurs also. अगर हम गोविंदेवजी जाएं, तो मेरे ख्याल से वहाँ के लोग सतपंच चौपाई मनोहर जरूर गा सकते हैं, सुना सकते हैं. But yeah, it's true. And those who are educated even in just Kadiboli Hindi, and especially English medium schools, they may find the Avadi quite difficult. There's no doubt about it. I've seen this many times. And I'm not trying to revive it. Texts have lives. They also have deaths.
Yep.
And, they decline in importance with time. I don't know if that will happen to the Manas or not. But it is an important text, and it is also a text that is full of interesting ideas. Tulsidas is a very interesting personality, and particularly in Balkand, where he's speaking in his own voice before the other narrators come in.
But Tulsidas has been attacked for being casteist. He praises the Brahmins
That's the Brahmin speaking. And I'm pointing it out.
Another Brahmin. Now,
Trivedi hai, Vajpayee hai,
or incidentally, Vajpayees must have been particularly hostile to Tulsidas because they thought themselves to be the custodians of knowledge, or what you have, wisdom, and they must have found it extremely embarrassing or perhaps disturbing that a great Sanskrit classic is now being written in a dialect, Avadhi. So instead of great Sanskrit being spoken by Ram and whoever, they are going to speak in Avadhi, which is like the language next door. So the entire heroism, Grameen and all that, so the great heroic halo is going to be reduced to a lamp in the kutia. So Tulsidas, I am told, I have not, Nambaji once told me, has, तुलसीदास तो खल वंदना भी करते हैं, शुरू में ही दुष्टों की भी वंदना करते हैं, यानी देवताओं की, उनकी वेद पुराण की, सबकी, और फिर दुष्टों की भी वंदना, खल वंदना करते हैं. I know of no other poet जिसने दुष्टों की भी वंदना की हो. हम लोग तो ज्यादातर दुष्टों की निंदा ही करते हैं. तो बहरहाल उसके बाद तुलसीदास ने कहीं पर वाजपेयियों की नाम लेकर निंदा की. तो एक बार मैंने अटल बिहारी वाजपेयी जो प्रधानमंत्री थे, एक फंक्शन में हम लोग अगल बगल बैठे थे, तो मैंने उनसे कहा कि आपको तो पता ही होगा कि वाजपेयी बहुत अहंकारी होते हैं. तो उन्होंने मेरी ओर देखा, फिर मैंने कहा नहीं, कुछ प्रतिभाशाली भी होते हैं. तो कहने लगे कि आप क्या पहेली बुझा रहे हैं. मैंने कहा पहेली नहीं बुझा रहा हूं, मैं अहंकारी, आप प्रतिभाशाली. तो बहरहाल, लेकिन जो बात मैं कह रहा था कि संस्कृत का बहुत अधिक प्रभाव है तुलसीदास पर. सीय रूप किम जाए बखानी, गिरा अनयन नयन बिन बानी. तो ये कि जीभ के पास आंखें नहीं हैं और आंखों के पास जीभ नहीं है, तो सीता का रूप कैसे बखान करें, क्योंकि सीय रूप किम जाए बखानी, यहां तक तो अवधि है, पर गिरा अनयन शुद्ध संस्कृत है, नयन बिन बानी ये फिर अवधि है. तो संस्कृत को अवधि में जीवित करना और संस्कृत की स्मृति को, उसके उत्तराधिकार को, कीप ऑन दैट इनहेरिटेंस अलाइव in the poetic mode is itself a great phenomena. And mind you, I sometimes think that the North Indian cultural mind has been colonized by two great poets, by Tulsidas and by Kabir. And they are two very different poets. But if you find amongst the, there was a survey conducted, we say there are 6 crore Kabir Panthis in India and Pakistan. 6 crore. And they all fight between themselves, like either all Panthis fight. So this is nothing new about them, but they have different views of Kabir, etc. And Tulsidas, you see, to exist as a great poet on your own terms, on the best standards of poetry, whatever you want, and yet to be popular. You know, it puts words like us, हम साले दुम छल्ले लगते हैं, हमारी क्या वक़्त है to this height that he is great and he is popular. We now have this other aspect in culture where the popular and the significant have parted company. So what is popular is hardly ever significant, and what is significant is hardly ever popular.
But you were pretty popular.
I'm not.
No. About the popular, I'll say just one word before Philip responds. There is a popular Ramkatha story being sold now. It's by Amish Tripathi. It's called the Sayanavi Ikshvaku. After the Meluha series, now he's taken up Ramchandra. In the Sayanavi Ikshvaku, everybody has read it. My question is, if that can sell 1 million or 2 million copies, why cannot this sell 500,000 copies?
Yes.
It's a similar price. In the Sayanavi Ikshvaku, there are people buying that. Ram is the deputy chief of police in Ayodhya, and Sita is the prime minister in Mithila. And before the Swayamvar, Sita goes to Ram secretly and tries to rig the breaking of the Shiva's bow to fix the match. Is that what we want to read in 1 million copies? And is this not what we want to read even in 500,000 copies? Please begin a movement for reading all this.
You see, reading in India and cultural illiteracy in India seem to be working in tandem. See, the more you read, the more culturally illiterate you are likely to be, unless you make some special effort to retrieve your own inheritance and to restore to yourself what is legitimately yours for centuries.
Have the last word.
Have the last word, then we open it to...
Okay. No, again, I'm much in agreement with what you say. I'm also a student of popular culture. Some of you may know I write on Hindi cinema. I have a website devoted to...
You even mentioned that how
so-called
Bollywood has been influenced by Ramcharitmanas.
No, I said that Ram and Sita's wedding is kind of the original Bollywood wedding. You know, it goes on for much of the second volume of my, the second half of the introduction of Balkan. No, I just wanted to add to what you said about Kabir. You know, there's a concert tonight in conjunction with the JLF by a wonderful singer named Mukhtiar Ali from Jaisalmer area.
Ajmer.
No, I think Jaisalmer he comes from.
Jaisalmer. Bikaner, sorry.
Bikaner, sorry.
Bikaner
wale.
Bikaner, yes.
And he is a wonderful singer who sings Sufi music. He sings Kabir wonderfully. He sings Mirabai wonderfully. And this kind of sangam that you find in Rajasthan, and we still, thank goodness, we find a good deal throughout North India. Thank heavens.
You know, Kumar Gandharv used to sing a Kabir bhajan, which came from the popular tradition, not from the Bijak.
Right.
Which used to say, Guruji, jahan baithu wahan chhaya ji. Guru, wherever I sit, wahan chhaya hai. There is a shadow. Yeah. Shadow of what? The Guru. Of the Guru.
The Guru.
तो उत्तर भारत में आप जहां भी बैठे, वहां आप पर दो छायाएं हैं, तुलसीदास की और कबीर की। अब आपको अगर छाया का पता ही नहीं है तो खुदा के लिए कुछ पता करिए, ऐसा भी क्या है?
So let me just briefly respond to your earlier point about what is sometimes called Brahmanvad.
Yes.
In the Manas.
Misogynist. He is very much against
there's that too, and all of this has been the subject of a great deal of writing, to which I briefly refer in the preface, in the introduction, and again, I don't try to elaborate very much on that. I hope that the translation will speak for itself. I hope that people will make their own judgments about Tulsidas's views on various subjects, on caste, on gender, on society. But since you're asking me to end, I will let him have the last word. And this is from Uttarakhand. And this is Ramji giving Upadesh to Bharat Ji, which I think we can consider fairly authoritative. Some of the more nasty comments about women are made by other characters in the book.
Character.
And some of the caste comments also. But this is Ramji speaking, and he says, Parahita sarasa dharma nahi bhai. Parahita sarasa dharma nahi bhai. There is no dharma like doing the welfare of others. There is no dharma, and these days we understand dharma often to mean religion. There is no religion equal to doing good to others. Parahita sarasa dharma nahi bhai, which is basically the golden rule, as they say in the West. Parapira sama nahi adhamai. There is no vileness, baseness, lowness, like causing pain to another.
Yes.
Yeah. So I like to think of that as a kind of upadesh.
You know, when Ram takes over in Ayodhya, firmly in his seat, on his Singhasan, etc., he addresses the citizens. And he says, if you ever think that I'm committed, doing something unethical, aniti, then, मेरे भाई, बिना डर के हमको बरजना. ये राजा कह रहा है प्रजा से, नागरिकों से, कि अगर तुमको लगे कि मैं अनीति कर रहा हूं तो बिना भय के हमको बरजना. तो there is a lot in our tradition by which we can resurrect some of the lost wisdom and some of the lost knowledge. Anyway, now is the time for the audience to ask questions. Let the questions be brief. Don't give your opinion. Opinions have been given already. Whatever they are.
Pura Ramayan nahi.
Yes, yes. And the lady here, please raise your hand again.
My question is why is it that the great legendary characters like Ram has to become Rama and Krishna has to become Krishna, and the great tradition of yoga has to become yoga, to cross borders and become internationalized?
That's a simple, that has to do with the fact that these terms originally were translated from Sanskrit, and in Sanskrit you pronounce the final a generally, and even in Tulsidas, for metrical purposes, we say Rama.
Abhirama.
Vando Nama Rama. So that's just a matter of pronunciation. But I don't do that in the book. I say Ram.
Not
R-A-M. Bas. TK.
Yes, the lady.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
I'm wondering, given the way this conversation's gone, are we looking at least a hope of a recovery of a tradition of poetry? Because Ramayan Padhana, Ramayan Gana, it's a leisurely activity which has been associated with religion, but we are talking about a tradition of living with poetry.
That's right.
And then sort of regretting that there is a Ram that polarizes and has been politicized and has become a shorthand for our religious aspirations.
Very good. Very good.
Are we looking at least a hope for some kind of recovery of poetry, of a tradition of poetry?
Yes.
In the vernacular? Is that
Yes.
Well, I'm an optimistic person, you know. The glass is half full rather than half empty. But I don't dare to make such hopes about my little effort here.
No,
I do want to say one thing. When I was doing my field work in the early 80s, and I've written a lot about this in the book Life of a Text, the Ramayana was as much about entertainment and family interaction for a lot of people as it was about some sort of religious holy thing. And some of my friends in Benares, they would debate the Ramayana furiously within the family, and they would say, you know, Ramji was not right in doing such and such, you know. And I love the statement that one elderly man made to me. He said, you know, he was a Ram Bhakta, and this was in a temple, and he said, you know, my Ram Bhakta hoon, I love Ram, he's my Ishta Deva, but I can never forgive him for what he did to Sita.
Yes, that's
in a tradition where that is so udar that somebody can say something like that,
and yet remain a Ram Bhakta.
And yet remain a Ram Bhakta. That I appreciate.
Yes, share, madam.
आप तीनों को रस की उत्पत्ति के लिए बहुत बधाई. And also for making this session a truly trilingual one. दो सवाल हैं मेरे. एक तो लड़ाई है हरीश भाई से, which is when you stated that at the end of your review, you said that you could not find the text. I work on oral traditions, and I have a different notion of a text. From the point of view of cultural performance, each performance is a text. So there's two different notions of textuality there.
Yep.
The second question I had, which is to Ashok ji and Philip bhai, which is that on the one hand you have the Mughal Empire, but on the other you have the empire of the Manas Katha. So that even in the Vajpayee household, which might be Brahminical, the Manas Katha comes in through the kitchen, right? Which is why your mother and your grandmother, in a sense, is performed by them. And that's really that's far more truly an empire of the people, from the people.
Well,
yeah, very briefly, that's the question. I totally agree with you. In the postmodernist, post-structuralist sense of Roland Barthes, everything is the text. Your utterance is the text, your question is the text, my response is the text. So there is that larger meaning of the text, and the text when performed does not cease to become a text. I totally agree with you. And there are some texts which are only available in performance. They have not been written down, they are oral texts. Kind of thing you've worked on. Yes, I totally agree with that. But in the case of Ramcharitmanas, which assumes life not in orality, but as a written text, as a deliberately written text out of scholarship and out of originality of imagination, I think we can distinguish between a text and a performance.
And to the other question,
Philip also has to answer.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, my book is precisely about that. It's about how does a big text, an epic, come to be the most important text in a culture in which the majority of people can't read.
Yeah.
At that time, it was a minuscule percentage of people who could read. So that's what the life of a text is all about. It was all about performance. So I'm very much in sympathy with your point.
I became a poet of some sort, and I think one of the reasons I became poet unconsciously must have been the fact that my mother revered poetry. That poetry was the god in our house, and therefore I became whatever kind of poet I became. So Tulsidas has many sins to his credit. Yes, there's the lady.
My question is to the entire panel there. Sitting in Professor Trivedi's MPhil seminars, we were told categorically to resist the urge to anachronistically apply political correctness to the text. But how do we see that, on one hand there is this caste and gender and all those problems in Tulsidas, but on the other hand, we have Bhavabhuti's Uttar Ramcharitam, which beautifully tackles these uncomfortable aspects of Ramchandra's life and does it so sympathetically. How do we see Tulsidas's resistance to that, the kind of political correctness that existed before him, the tradition which was existing before him?
I don't know whether it was political correctness, but let me point out in Bhavabhuti, Ram suffers from a deep sense of doubt at what he has done. So when he relinquishes Sita to Valmiki's ashram, he finds his hand later shivering, and he addresses that hand that now that you are abandoning Sita, you are shivering. Why didn't you shiver when I killed the innocent Shambhuk? So already within the Ram Katha tradition, there are elements which do raise questions about Ramhood in a certain sense. And later in Hindi you have Matishan Gup's Urmila, a whole Saket, I mean the whole, again an epic in which what was meted out to those who one never hears about what happened to Urmila. I mean, Lakshman went away and leaving Urmila behind, whatever happened to her, etc. So, but these are all part, when you question a tradition, you are enhancing it, you are deepening it. Any tradition which is not open to question is not worth following. And no, I don't have, I don't know how much time we have.
I don't think we are left with any time.
So,
I'm so sorry, it's time is out.
Thank you very much for being there.
Thank you, Philip Plattendorf, Ashok Vajpayee ji and Harish Trivedi ji. They will be there at the back of the stage. You can have your chat. I will urge all of you not to come here and block this area. Thank you so much.
So do you like your hair? No. You don't like your hair?
I want my hair to be straight because when you have your hair straight, it's really smooth.
Do you think that's more beautiful?
Yeah. Doesn't really feel good to have curly hair. I try to make it straight, but it doesn't work. I try
Any
to
of
do
you
this.
have the book of Philip? He will be going at the back of the stage in the auto signing area for signing the book. So if you buy the books, he will be around in the festival grounds. You can catch him and get your book signed.
But it doesn't work.
Sometimes I just wish I could just rip it out, but I'm not going to do that.
I think about my hair that I don't want it anymore. That feeling makes me sad sometimes when I leave out my hair.
I think a lot of people are asking about that.
Now, honey, you know you're amazing every day.
I think a lot of people want to know if this session literature versus cinema that has been moved from Bathurk and it will be here at 2:30. Literature versus cinema at 2:30 in the Mughal tent.
Perfect this way.
One, two, three, four. We all love our girls. We all love our hair. We all love our girls. We all love our hair. We all love our girls. We all love our hair. We all
ठीक है भाई साहब, भैया।
हिंदी सिर्फ एक भाषा नहीं, हमारा संस्कार, हमारा इतिहास है। हिंदी एक सोच है, जीवन जीने का तरीका है। अपनी भाषा को इज्जत देना अपने वजूद को सम्मान देने जैसा है। हिंदुस्तान की सैकड़ों भाषाएं हिंदी में शामिल हैं, इसलिए हमेशा से सबकी पसंदीदा है। देश के सबसे बड़े हिंदी अखबारों में एक है पत्रिका। उत्तर भारत से लेकर पूर्व पश्चिम दक्षिण तक सबके दिलों में बसा। आज राजस्थान पत्रिका केवल अखबार नहीं, रेडियो, टीवी, मोबाइल, इंटरनेट और अन्य साधनों से लोगों की बात उठाता है। लोगों को जीता है तो उनके दिल जीत कर देखिए। हिंदी पढ़िए और हिंदी बोलिए। राजस्थान पत्रिका, देश का प्रमुख समाचार पत्र समूह।
We believe in bringing the world together through entertainment. See entertainment. Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. The world is my family.
हीरे मोती से कब तोड़ती हैं खुशियाँ, शोहरत दूर की कमां, बाजार में कब बिकती हैं खुशियाँ, शोहरत दूर की कमां। दिल बड़ा
अच्छाई की एक अलग चमक होती है। रजनीगंधा सिल्वर पर्ल्स, सिल्वर कोटेड इलायची।
गेम्स, मूवीज और म्यूजिक के 71 लाख 21,302 मिनट, ये सब फिट होता है एक छोटी सी दुनिया में।
Free music, movies and games only on Airtel, the smartphone network. The all-new Ford Endeavour.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody having good time? Have you been able to, I know you are here, you've gotten a seat, but how's it in the other venues, the session you wanted to attend, were you able to get the seat? No. So that's why you came here. Now we have some lovely, interesting sessions here, and I just want to tell all of you one session which was supposed to be in Batak at 1:40, literature versus cinema, influence in shaping beauty, that has been shifted from Batak to Mughal tent at 2:30. The Negroland, that session has been cancelled. So in place of that, we will have literature versus cinema at 2:30 here. For now, the session here is Picture This with Esther Freud and Hannah Rothschild, introduced by Alexandra Pringle, and that's a Women Uninterrupted series. We have many sessions here which are sort of, around the women, and those are Women Interrupted series. So this is one of those sessions. Do you tweet, all of you? Have you been tweeting about JLF? Any of you have tweeted or collected points and then collected goodies from here? Any of you? The tweeters? None of you are the tweeters? But anyway, I just want to let you know that if you tweet at hashtag ZJLF, you get points and collect points, and when you have enough points for that, you can go to the information desk, they'll have the information, you collect points, and then you collect the JLF goodies, which are quite nice. So keep tweeting, keep sending pictures, your opinion about any session, or any favorite author, or any favorite venue, or whatever, something I would say nice, good about JLF, or your opinion. Keep tweeting at hashtag ZJLF. Yeah, that will be here. Yeah. No. The other sessions will be, if I get the information. Right now, I don't have any information about session 97. It is supposed to be here. It will be here at 3:45. Yeah? I know in this venue, people have been wonderful. I don't know whether I'm very strict or whatever, but nobody is reserving the seat, and I'll expect the same throughout today, tomorrow, and day after, that, you don't reserve seats. Take one seat, no seat for your bag or for your jacket. If you come with a cup of tea, or anything which you wanted to eat during the session, take the empty plate, empty glass with you, keep the venue clean as it was. And if you see anything, which is just, around and it's not looking nice, pick it up, throw it in the bin. There are plenty around. And your phones should be on silent. It's very disturbing to the authors and to the people who are sitting around you, who are here just to listen to the authors. So if you have an urgent call, go outside, have your chat and come back, but don't talk on the phone while sitting in the session. Another thing which I notice and I find it very disturbing, and I'm sure it is very disturbing for the authors who are here for you, that when the session is over and we have the question answer session, people just sort of get up, start going to the next session or whatever is in their mind, they get up and going. I would say sit through the session, sit through the question answer session. Sometimes you get to listen a little more, and even when a question is asked, in the answer you will see some more from the authors, which can be very valuable, very good. So don't leave in the middle of the session, unless you have to for some emergency or urgency you have to leave. You can do that, of course. And for security, we are all very much in control here, but in case of any emergency, we have marked all the exits. Just stay calm. We will be with you. We will lead you to safety, but stay calm and exit quietly and without causing any kind of stampede or anything. I don't think that'll happen. It has never happened. We are totally conscious about the security arrangements here. But in case of emergency, just follow the instructions. We will be with you. We will take you a secure exit. So I'll just check on our authors. They should be here. They have been very nice, wonderful. They are always here in time. I'll just go connect with them and I'll be back with the session. Picture this: Esther Freud, Hannah Rothschild with Alexandra Pringle. Esther Freud, Hannah Rothschild, Alexandra Pringle for the session Picture This, Women Uninterrupted series. 3 great women on stage for you.
Thank you. I'm fine. No, don't tighten it. Yes. Okay. Can you all hear all right? All right, thank you. My name is Alexandra Pringle, and I'm Editor-in-Chief of Bloomsbury Publishing. And I'm very, very happy to be here today, both to be in Jaipur, but to be with 2 very special authors, Esther Freud and Hannah Rothschild. If I lose my voice, I'll just leave it to them. I'm sorry. I'm a bit croaky today. This is a very unusual event. It's unusual because writers rarely step into the art world. And when they do, in my opinion, they usually fall flat on their faces. There are some exceptions. I think Joyce Carey's novel, The Horse's Mouth, is one, but they're very few. And it's quite something that 2 novels have come out within 24 months of each other that both have the world of art and artists at their centre. In their very different ways, they are both exceptional works, and they are indeed works of art themselves. Esther and Hannah share other things, family matters in a way, which I hope we'll touch on. But first, I just want to talk a little about each of these writers. Esther Freud's first novel, Hideous Kinky, was published in 1992, and I was lucky enough to be the editor on the book way back then. It was immediately a book that was embraced by the public. It was also made into a film starring Kate Winslet, as somehow it's a book that has just continued in the air, as some books do. And indeed, the title, Hideous Kinky, which I had colleagues at the time who said, you can't call a book Hideous Kinky. And then the title was used by newspapers over and over again. Things became Hideous Kinky. With that, her first book, she was chosen by Granta magazine as one of their best of young British writers. And Esther went on to write a further 6 novels, before this her 8th, Mr. Mac and Me. And it takes a year in the life of the Scottish artist Charles Rennie Mackintosh, in which he spent many miles away, thousands of miles away from his home in Scotland on the east coast of England just before the First World War broke out. The Sunday Telegraph wrote, an elegiac novel of art, war and friendship, her fine evocation of Mackintosh's melancholy on the home front, expressed in his painstaking watercolours of local flowers, celebrates the power of art to outlast both man-made and natural disasters. I think this is Esther's very finest book so far. And Esther is, of course, the daughter of the great painter Lucian Freud and the great-granddaughter of Sigmund Freud. Hannah Rothschild also comes from an extremely unusual and interesting family. She's the daughter of Jacob Rothschild, banker, arts philanthropist, and an extraordinary force of culture. Hannah is a documentary filmmaker. Both Hannah and Esther started in different professions. Esther was an actor when I first met her, and Hannah is a documentary filmmaker, and she particularly made films about artists. Her first book, The Baroness, was about her extraordinary great-aunt, Nico Rothschild, who left her chateau, her husband, and many children in pursuit of the jazz musician Thelonious Monk after just hearing one of his records one day. Hannah is a trustee of the Tate Gallery, and she's the first ever woman chair of the National Gallery of Art, and indeed the first ever woman chair of any major art museum in Europe. This is an amazing thing. And The Improbability of Love is her first novel. It's set in the art world, and in this novel she manages to do something extremely difficult, to combine delicious satire with an underlying theme of what happened to art owned by Jews during the Second World War. And I believe many Rothschild paintings disappeared during this time. As the art critic John Richardson, the biographer of Picasso, said, satirical, provocative, and exceedingly humorous, this novel has fun with today's art world. Rothschild delights us with glimpses of London life as louche, chic, and freakish as early Evelyn wore. So first of all, Esther's going to talk a bit about her book and read from it, and then Hannah will do that.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's really so nice to be here with Alexandra, who I've been edited with by for pretty much my entire writing career. I feel very blessed. And Hannah, whose book I just finished on the plane here and loved and laughed and was moved by. It's just absolutely brilliant. This book, Mr. Mac and Me, is it's really the story of a young boy called Thomas Maggs. He's a 13-year-old son of the man who runs the local village pub in a little village right on the coast, the most easterly coast of England. And his family are very poor, and they had many, many children. And as I discovered when I was researching this, so many people's children died in infancy at this time. And he is the 8th but only surviving son of this family, maybe the 7th, in fact, I think of it. He was born with a lame leg, so he's limping, and because his parents are very fearful for his future, that he won't be able to work in the fields or work on boats going out to sea, which are the two professions that the people in the village tend to work in. They send him to a school where he will learn to be a clerk, hopefully, or something where he uses his mind and his hands rather than his feet and his body. But what Thomas loves more than anything is the sea. And because he's not allowed to go to sea, he starts to go and sit by the river in the estuary where the boats come in and draw pictures of the boats. And that's probably all you need to know. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the beginning where he first comes across this very unusual figure to arrive in the village, this mysterious Scottish man who appears, and eventually he and Thomas become friends. I always bring my glasses and almost always forget to put them on. I know the book so well that often I just kind of wing it, but I remember today. Mr. Runnicles is losing patience with me. When he looks through my books, he says I must copy out my work at home with no sketches and no blots, neat and tidy. That's what he wants from me, without a single picture of a boat. There's a table in the public bar set against the wall, just big enough for my ledger, and I like to sit there on a Saturday morning when Father is away over at the brewery ordering the ale. But this Saturday, a man comes in, not anyone I've seen before, and he stands at the bar talking to Mother. He's got a gruff voice, low and hard to understand, with rolling R's and sudden lifts and burrs, and if I close my eyes, I can hear the chimes and rises in it, like the girls who come down from the Highlands every year to gut and pack the herring. But those girls are mostly red and pink and jolly, whereas this man is dark, with a stern, pale face and eyes as black as bark. Glasgow, he tells Mother, is where he's from. Scotland's first city, a great bustling place, the best there is, although he's ready just for now to be leaving it behind. He coughs then, and a shudder runs through him, even though it is July and warm. He orders a pint of beer and a half of stout to take back to his wife, who's preparing a picnic at Millside, and he hands over 2 stoppered flasks to be filled. Millside. I cease my copying, and I listen hard to see if he says anything about the Millside ghost. I want to ask him if he's ever heard the sound of apples falling. A woman had been buried there, a tall woman. They found her remains when they put a new mill shaft in. And the sound of apples falling, heavy as a cart, tipped up, is the sound that's been heard just before they see her gazing in at them through an upstairs window. Before I have a chance, the man is standing at my table looking down. Very nice, he says, and I feel myself heat up as I try to push the mess of my first copying out of the way. No, he bends closer, and asking if he can, he lifts the paper with the smudges and inspects my margin full of boats. There are yawls and wherries, barges, smacks, and one long yacht with a cabin and a galley. Do you make these sketches from memory, he asks, and I have to look up at him to catch the oddness of his speech. Yes, I say, because I don't want Mother knowing how often I sit beside the river and copy the boats that are moored there, or how many hours I spend staring into the glass cabinets of the sailors' reading room where models of all the greatest ships are on display. Schooners and frigates, warships and cruisers, and one big old fishing boat that Danke made one winter when there was no fishing to be done. Very nice indeed. The Scotsman hands back my book, and he pays Mother her money, and he goes out with his flasks. It is only a day or two before I see the Scotsman again, walking along beside the river. Mac, he is called. At least that's what they call him when they whisper his business in the bar. And now I see why he is making so much talk. He looks for all the world like a detective. He's wearing a great black cape and a hat of felted wool, and he is puffing on a pipe as if he's Sherlock Holmes. He has a bad foot. I hadn't noticed that before. His shoe is all stacked up, although it doesn't stop him walking fast with his stick hitting the ground, so that I have to hurry after with my own twisted foot to keep him in my sights. He crosses the bridge, and I keep down behind the dunes as he heads for the beach. Every few minutes he halts and looks back, as if he suspects he might be being seen, he might be being followed, but it can't be me he sees. I know the land too well. It's getting dark. There is a big moon, pale as cloud, hanging over the sea, and for a long time he walks along the tide line. I keep to the high land, dipping down into the marram grass whenever he looks round. But then it seems that he accepts he is alone, because he stops and stares out at the waves. He must be searching for clues of some kind, just like Mr. Holmes, and he's looking so hard he doesn't seem to notice how the water is washing in around his boots. I leave him to it and go back to the harbour to see if any of the night fishermen have come to untie their boats. But all is quiet, so I sit there on the wall, wondering what Mother will say now that I've missed my chores, and wishing I hadn't seen that look on Father's face, which means it is a drinking day and there's nothing I can do. I'll wait, I think, until he's too unsteady to lash out. And then there he is, Mac, standing right in front of me, the pipe puffing white into the night. Enjoy your walk, he asks, and without even the flicker of a smile, he limps away up the street and over the green, so that for a long while, even though I'm half starved for having missed my supper, I'm too frightened to follow. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Esther. I must say, I read and loved your book the first time, but now I'm going to read it again, having heard that. So my novel is completely different in many respects, apart from the fact that it revolves around art and artists and that kind, but the milieu is very different. So I set my novel in London, which is a city where I live and I love, and I set it in the art world, which is a milieu. What was interesting when he spoke about art, and I think this is what I really was objected to in the art history classes, he never tried to analyze them. And I think when my first lesson in art history, when someone said, you see this, it means this, and I thought, who are you to say? How do you know? I don't agree, and I felt sort of shuttered out by it. Whereas he spoke about I don't know, he used language terribly well. He spoke well about whatever he spoke about, to be honest. I think I have two sisters who are writers as well. It's not surprising that 3 of his children have become writers, or even maybe 4, because we were very inspired by the way he used language.
I think rather interesting, and if you look at all your work together, is that your father is there, because a lot of your books are very autobiographical, and this book isn't. It's the least, it is not autobiographical. It's very much part of England that you love. But in some way, so Lucian is a shadowy figure, quite an absent figure, but he's there in your other novels a lot. But in some ways, he's more present in this one than in any others. Do you feel that, or is it?
I hadn't ever thought about it, but I think all my books, whether they're obviously semi-autobiographical or not, I'm using something. I need to feel I own a story in order to write it, so it needs to feel very personal. And when I first heard the story about Charles Rennie Mackintosh, I thought it's a great story, but it's not for me, it's not my story. And I only started to feel able to write it when I realized that the house I was living in many years before, used to be the village pub, and it had been knocked down and taken by wheelbarrow, brick by brick, to another part of the village and rebuilt and sold as a holiday house. And one of the people who'd stayed there was Charles Rennie Mackintosh. So I started thinking, Charles Rennie Mackintosh stood in this room, he slept in this room, he went up these stairs. And then I thought, oh yes, I know Charles Rennie Mackintosh, he's my friend. And I basically went to it that way. So I was thinking about him, but it's nice that the things that you know for nothing kind of intervene and give richness to your writing. And I think that is the case. People often write autobiographically, even if it's not obvious.
Yes.
Even if they don't even realize it themselves.
So you have a powerful and idiosyncratic father, and you do, Hannah. So how has he affected your life and your work, and particularly as a novelist?
I think everything feeds in, doesn't it, to your life and your work. And my mother feeds in. There's a mother of the young woman in this book, by the way, is a helpless alcoholic. But for the record, my mother is not a helpless alcoholic. The father in the book one of the fathers in the book is a really nasty kind of Nazi, and by the way, my dad is not a nasty Nazi. So there are, in fact, people often in this book try and pinpoint people and try and say that must be so-and-so and that must be so-and-so.
Because some of them you can recognise.
Some of them may well indeed have resonances with real people. But so yes, no, I think it'd be impossible actually to write without everything feeding in. Actually, I think it would be almost impossible. I don't think that my father or my mother particularly play into any of these characters, but I might be being completely, I don't think so. I mean, they're obviously always there, and they shape everything I've done in many ways, or shape lots of things I've done, but I don't think they're particularly role models. I mean, there are role models in this book. I mean, there's one of the characters, he's called Barty, and he's based absolutely on a man called Nicky Haslam, who's a kind of bon vivant decorator, who has this extraordinary thing. He goes in when nouveau riche people arrive in London, so for example oligarchs or Arab sheikhs, they find him. And this is true, and he won't deny this, nor I think will any of them. I've made a film about him, in fact. And he goes in there and he basically gives them a life, because they arrive with a huge amount of money but nothing else. They don't know where to live, they don't know what to put on their walls, they don't know which clubs to join, they don't know what hobbies to have. And Nicky ostensibly is their decorator, but actually he does a lot more than that. And he literally says, right, you will collect art, you will get into horse racing, you will live in Chester Square, you will go to this tailor, you will go to this dietitian. And he kind of gives them this rather wonderful instant life. And I couldn't resist putting him in this book. In fact, I wouldn't have a party without having him, so why would I write a book without him in it somehow?
What did he think of it? Did he love it?
Darling, I think I could have done it slightly better. He was very, and now of course he's writing a novel, I suspect about himself, but he says, darling, definitely not. It's bound to be. So, and you now have this incredible position at the National Gallery, and the historian Anthony Beaver wrote, this brilliant satire on the highest echelons of the art market is a bold move by the National Gallery's chair of trustees. Did you feel that there was a tension or a conflict from having this new position and writing this? Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think writing a book is it was a dream writing a novel, and writing this novel was a dream which I'd kind of, harboured for many years. And I wrote it and I wrote it and I wrote it, but I don't know what you've written many more books than I have, Esther, but when I was writing, I wasn't really thinking at the time about publication or about reception or about, how it would play. I was really concentrating on trying to get to the end and trying to make it as good as I possibly could. And then I remember I was actually on holiday and I got a call saying that Alexandra wanted the book. I remember there were these twin kind of things of first this kind of unbelievable excitement that this thing I spent so many years writing, somebody, and it was her, of all people, who I desperately wanted to publish it, wanted to publish it, followed quickly by, oh no! What does this mean, and what are they going to say, and what if it's no good, and what if people find all the mistakes and they expose my ignorance and all that stuff. So, you know, but by then there was a kind of momentum and it came out, and luckily it went down okay. But it was a risk, and I think that it was a huge risk. I'm glad I took the risk, but in retrospect it took a lot of...
Did you feel vulnerable when it came out?
So vulnerable. I mean, perhaps that's a feeling that you get every book.
Some books by far worse than others.
Right.
And, you know, it depends on what you are risking. I mean, I was talking in a session yesterday and I said one of the things that you need as a writer is to be courageous. And certainly with my first book, I wrote it. In fact, almost all my books, I try not ever to think that they're going to be published. It's almost of no interest to me. It's so hard to get from one page to the next that I'm just trying to deal with that particular problem. And also, you don't know for a really long time whether the book's ever going to work. So it seems pointless to think about anyone ever reading it, because they may not. I have a few abandoned books in my drawers of my study. So that really is the least of your worries. And then there's a point where I had the same thing. Alexandra was going to publish my first book, and I had incredible excitement and real fear because it was very exposing.
It is, no, and I think it's also, you know, it's not an autobiographical book, but, you know, there is a woman at its heart who's been, you know, quite unlucky in love, and I kept thinking, oh goodness, everyone's going to think, you know, and then maybe they're going to be right, and then what am I going to say about that? So that was, you know, I did feel I felt exposed professionally and personally, but I had a slight inkling of what it was like, because the first book I wrote, The Baroness, was about my family, and actually, if you want to really feel vulnerable, write a book about your family, because, you know, that, you know, if you, that exposes, in fact, we're talking about this in another session, that really exposes a lot of, you know, skeletons, and the skeletons come and clunk you on the head, you know, all times of day and night. So, I don't know, writing, I think it is for the brave, actually. I think that's true.
And then there's that extraordinary thing when, as the publisher, you read a book, you read it in manuscript, and it's this creature. It's very different from reading a finished bound book. And the only way I can describe what happens with books like both of these first novels, that finding a writer for the first time, is it is literally like falling in love. It's absolutely bizarre, and you feel sick in your stomach, and you kind of tingle, and you think, if I don't do this book, if I don't get to publish it, I'll die. And it's quite dramatic. And I literally had that with Hideous Kinky, and I had that with The Improbability of Love. You can't get it for all your books, but every now and again you get it, and those are the really special ones. So I now want to move on to Jewishness, okay? Because it occurred to me as I was on the train from Delhi to Jaipur that there is something there, obviously not in your novel, Esther, but in your families and the way that you have worked your way through and out into the world that you're in and into your art, that I think does come from the kind of not just being Jewish, but being born, your family coming from a different place and drifting over to other lands, other cultures, and being often adrift in cultures, and then how you find your way into them. And I think, and there are two writers who came to mind as I was thinking this, and one was obviously Edmund de Waal with The Hair with the Amber Eyes, and I think particularly with you, Hannah, and, you know, an extraordinary family of collectors, many generations, and being kind of blown by events in the 20th century in particular into other places. And then with Esther W.G. Sebald and his attachment to the same bit of English coastland that you have. So I just wondered if that makes sense to you, if you think about it. Esther, do you want to start?
It is interesting that sort of, I think less really maybe about the Jewishness of my kind of heritage, but more about the fact that both my parents, or my father was Jewish, my mother Irish, that they both had to sort of make new lives for themselves. And there's a toughness, I think, that comes from that. There's a kind of grit about starting again, recreating yourself. And oddly enough for me, both my parents made decisions quite early on in their life that they really wanted pretty much nothing to do with any of their families. So I was brought up very much sort of almost like feeling like a kind of child in time. I had no relatives that I knew, hardly at all. Certainly none nearby. Occasionally we would go to Ireland and I would see my mother's family. But she used to often take us and leave us there, me and my sister, rather than stay there. So it was childcare for her. And so there was that feeling for me. I wrote 2 novels that I've used my kind of Jewish ancestry and brought them in and tied them in. And I did it for myself because I needed to feel like I belonged to a larger family. I think every generation rebels. I think I didn't know my grandfather because I didn't know any of my father's relatives, apart from the ones I've met just myself through my own volition. My grandfather apparently was sort of family-minded, more sentimental, liked having his family around, lived next door to his wife's sister, etc. Whereas my father didn't want anything to do with it. I love my family. I can't have enough of them. I'm always, inviting all my different relatives, sisters, cousins' children. So I've kind of rebelled in the only way I knew I could, by being really sentimental. That's what I could do. But I wrote a book called Gaglo, and I used some of my family history that I really had to research and make up because no one said anything. And by doing that, I kind of cloaked myself with history and with some kind of feeling of belonging. And it really made a difference. It really bolstered me up.
And then there's also landscape, which is interesting because your family, the fact that they found a piece of England that reminded them of where they came from in Germany and how that's affected you.
That was been hugely important to me. It's almost been the great love affair of my adult life. When I was in my early 20s, I complained to my father that I desperately needed to get out of London. And he said, there is a sort of rather dreary little cottage in a really awful, terrible seaside village. I used to spend my childhood holidays there. My parents had a house there. There's still a house that is in the family. Literally never heard of any of this. And he gave me the telephone number of a cousin that I'd never heard of. And I phoned her and she said, yes, you can rent it. On a November weekend, she told me where the key was under a flower pot in the porch of a house by the church. I arrived and it was like falling in love. I went, this is my favourite place in the whole world. And I've hardly had a month where I haven't been since. That was 30 years ago. I now have a house there. This is where Mr. Macamee is set. I now have a house. One of my cousins has a house next door. Another cousin has the house next door to that. We have all the land behind. All our children play. It's literally like the best thing in my life, and my children's too. And
it was born in the first place because it
in the 30s, when my grandparents were emigres, and in 1933 they decided very wisely to leave Berlin and come to England. They tried to find an equivalent idyllic holiday house to remind them of the house they'd had on the Baltic coast, a little island called Hiddensee, off an island called Rügen. And they found this little tiny village in Suffolk with this flat. I have a letter actually that I found that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother and said, the sea is nearly as cold at Hiddensee, and there's even more mosquitoes. And it was like, hooray, we found this place. And I feel completely connected to them being there. So that really has been important.
And what about you, Hannah?
My family were in a ghetto in Frankfurt for a very, very long time, a place of such indescribable squalor that people used to go there just to have a look to see how these Jews could survive. And you have Goethe and George Eliot write about this place, and they write about the Jews they see they were allowed out during the day, but at night they were kept in this very, very short street that had no sanitation, no running water. It was supposed to be for a few hundred people, but many, many thousand people lived in there. And that's where the Rothschilds started. And then it was bombed during a kind of French invasion, and the Jews were allowed out, amazingly, and their faces were so pale that people thought they came from another world because they never saw any sunlight because the street was so narrow. And famously, the patriarch, the Rothschild patriarch, sent his 5 sons to the 5 capitals of Europe. So we ended up in England. So I come from that, the English branch, which came here in the late 1790s. So since then, the family's done very well and has integrated, quite successfully into society, all over the place, frankly. But we still feel like outsiders. And I'm so pleased that I retain that feeling of being an outsider. And I don't know whether that's Jewishness. I don't know whether that's, I don't quite know what that is, but I've never felt absolutely integrated. And I think that's quite helpful in a funny way. I mean, I know my home is England, which I love with an absolute passion. I know I have a very strong sense of family, as you do too, but I never feel complacent about where I am. I never feel, yes, these are my people, this is my thing. I feel slightly transient, and I think that helps us, and I think it's helped us stop becoming completely insufferable, perhaps. Don't know.
So we're going to go on to questions very soon, so I'm going to ask a last one, again about families, because, well, I find families so interesting. They are, in a way, the most interesting thing in the world, and I think we create families around us all the time in different little groups, and indeed publishing is very much about creating a family. But both of your families have had such a profound effect on the cultural life, particularly in the 20th century, and they are big. They're not just one big person, it's like a big family, Sigmund Freud, not just Lucian Freud, generations of yours. Has it been a blessing or a curse? Do you understand?
I feel really blessed, I have to say, because in a way, maybe because I wasn't brought up, I was brought up very much with my mother, very unaware of this I didn't feel any weight, I didn't feel any pressure, there was no expectations, we were sort of rather itinerant, kind of felt a bit nomadic, and then there was this sort of kind of glimmer of glamour and excitement that my father represented, and then when I sort of joined in as a teenager, when I was old enough to kind of join in with the family, it felt exciting. And also my father never really spoke about he never spoke about the great fruit, as his nickname for his grandfather. So it was very irreverent, there was no pressure, there was no feeling. But what my father did instill in his children was that anything you do should be done on your own merit. Never take any kind of credit for anyone else's achievements. So there's been very little kind of name dropping or entitlement in my family, but there has been inspiration. And inspiration just through sheer discipline and hard work and being passionate about whatever it is. That's why I feel blessed.
Actually, I felt an enormous weight of my family, really, sometimes almost insufferable weight. I mean, I felt that, some of them are bankers, and I'm pretty much enumerate. Some of them are unbelievably clever and got, starred everything at every university you could imagine, and I kind of crept into university in their wake. They seemed to be people who were absolutely brilliant at what they did, and I was terrified that I couldn't live up to them. I just thought, I'm never, ever going to be able to live up to any of these people, male and females, actually. And I think what happened, I was lucky enough to go and get an independent career, independent of my family, and I actually worked at the BBC for most of my kind of young adult life. In fact, through to very recently, I worked at the BBC up until 2010, and that gave me huge confidence, because I thought I'm in an organisation where actually it's almost a disadvantage to have a big name behind you. I was teased mercilessly by everybody there all the time. But I did all right, I made a career there, I did okay, and once I felt that I could stand on my own 2 feet and I could do something in my own right, I was then able to actually make the most of my heritage, which of course is fantastic, and I'm very, very, very fortunate in so many different ways, but it took me a long time to be able to feel that, not so much live up to it, but think, okay, it's fine, I am who I am, and this is what it is, and just enjoy it. I think maybe I've got there now, but it's taken, I don't know how old I am, but it's taken quite a long time.
And did you, because both of you had different careers first, did you always want to write?
I always wanted to be a storyteller, and that's
Yeah.
and I was very seduced by film. I was, I remember the Sunday afternoons at home. It was the only time we were allowed to watch television was the Sunday afternoon matinee, and so I used to watch films every week. And I was completely seduced by films and wanted to go into filmmaking. And actually, the BBC at that time to me was the apotheosis of everything fantastic. So I wanted to work there, and eventually I got to work there. But storytelling, I wrote the whole way through that, not sometimes, for journalism and other things like that. But I never really thought I'd be a novelist. I mean, I'm not sure I quite accept that I'm a novelist yet. Maybe you have to write a few books before you can do that.
And Esther, going from acting, that was...
I also wanted to tell stories. I never imagined I could be a writer because I was not particularly academic, or I just couldn't, it seemed just an ambition beyond one I would even give myself. So I was an actress and I loved the telling of the stories. But then just naturally I started to write, and writing just became my real pleasure. And then I wrote what turned into a book, to my amazement, and I imagined I might do both, but actually writing made me really happy. And I realized then that acting didn't make me very happy. And so I just felt incredibly lucky that I'd managed to find a way of crossing to a much more nourishing career.
Okay, we must squeeze some questions in.
We actually have got just 3 minutes, so,
I'm so sorry.
Maybe just one question. Just one question, or maybe you're so much you would love to.
There is a question over there.
So we take a question. Okay, so just one question, and then unfortunately we have to.
Sorry, my watch is 5 minutes off.
Me too. I maybe has.
Sorry, Hi, my name is Abhijit Bhargav, and I'm a journalism student. So my question to you is you said that if you want to be nervous, if you want to be really nervous, you must write about your family.
So can you hold the microphone slightly closer to my mouth?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You just said that if you want to feel really nervous, you should write about your family. But my question is, and then you talked about the family values and how much you should cherish your family. So my question is, should a writer have any kind of secrets, even if regarding their families? Because we all have skeletons in our closet.
So basically, should a writer ever have secrets?
Yeah, of course. I've got millions of secrets. I'm saying I won't tell anyone else. Come on, more. It's only my first novel. No, I know, exactly. I can eke them out.
I have very few secrets left after 8 novels. There's not much that doesn't know about me.
But you should use those secrets in your novels, in your writing, so that other people can learn and read.
I don't think you need to use up secrets particularly, but the really powerful parts, the really authentic parts of anyone's work is when it means a lot to you. And there's sometimes things that is quite painful to write about. I've written things in my books that I never said to anybody, but I have other things that I want to write about that have been quite traumatic, and I found that I couldn't go there. Maybe I'm just not ready yet, or maybe I just never will, and I will try not to upset. But I'm not. I have to say, in a selfish way, I'm not avoiding it because I'm frightened to upset people. If it's good, I'll write it. I'm just not able to do it quite yet, maybe.
So is that the piece of glass in a writer's heart?
Yeah, for me, I'm such a, in my life, I love to get on with people. In my writing, I'm ruthless. I'm shocked by myself.
I think I have to take lessons.
Writers have to be ruthless, I'm afraid. Are we through, or was that?
We're almost through, yeah.
Okay.
If you can just close the session,
all right.
that'll be wonderful.
Okay. So I'd just like to say thank you. What a wonderful, illuminating, fascinating session this has been. I feel we've learned about the art world, about literature, about families and displacement and so many things. And I'd just like everybody to say thank you so very much to Hannah and to Esther.
Once again, a big round of applause for Hannah Rothschild, Esther Floyd and Alexandra Pringle for being here. They have so much to say, and unfortunately the sessions are for just 1 hour, but I'm sure they will be there at the back. They'll be signing the books, and you can have a conversation with them. You can ask your questions to them, and I'm sure they will be delighted to answer your questions. Thank you for being here.
can we request everybody to please stay off the aisles? It's much more convenient and there's an easier way for everybody to exit the area if you keep off the aisles. Can we please request you all to do that? Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Yes. Can you take them to signing tents? Hannah and Esther, they will be going at the back to the author signing area. You can go with your book there and can get your book signed. I just want to request all of you, the middle area. I don't want to people be in the middle area. The middle area has to be totally vacant. All of you, there's no seats in the front, so no point coming to the front. The next one here will be a book launch. Yeah, a book launch, Rajasthan on a platter. That's the next session here, a book launch.